Ladies and gentlemen, the Midwest Energy Summit will begin in 5 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, the Midwest Energy Summit will begin in 1 minute. Please take your seats. Once again, the Midwest Energy Summit will begin in 1 minute. Please take your seats. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the President and CEO of the Fargo-Moorhead West Fargo Chamber of Commerce, Shannon Full.
Morning, Brecca. Good morning, everyone. Welcome, welcome. It's good to see everyone out there today. Thank you for joining us all today at the Delta by Marriott, and thank you to the 31 co-hosting chambers of commerce and associations from across the upper Midwest, the 3 states, who are actually streaming this out to their viewers today. So we have a fabulous in-person audience, and then a warm welcome to all of you that are joining us virtually. Get ready for an engaging conversation as we take a very close look at what is happening today and what is to come related to energy and in our region and the nation. Our goal is to invigorate your perspective on this sector and its far-reaching impacts on our businesses, communities, and lives. As a part of our Midwest Summit series, the Midwest Energy Summit serves as a crucial platform to convene the brightest minds and leaders in this space, regional, national, and global companies, elected officials, and community leaders, all coming together to educate each other, work together, share ideas, and keep the Midwest connected, competitive, and leading in ideas and innovation. Today's speakers will bring expertise and insight that not all of us experience or are able to hear on a daily basis. From transportation and supply chain to geopolitics to carbon capture, utilization, storage, and how all of this affects every single one of us now and into the future. You won't want to miss anything that our keynote speakers and panelists have to say. We are so very glad that you're here with us today. We also encourage you to engage with our speakers throughout the event by submitting your questions to them. Those of you that have been here before know how this goes. There's a QR code on the screen and on your tables that you can scan and submit your questions so that we can read them up here on stage and answer them. So now's the time to thank and shine a well-deserved light on our sponsors and make this growing Midwest Summit possible. The leadership from these businesses is truly enhancing our region's ability to have conversations like this, spanning across the Midwest and allowing us to bring thought leader speakers in from all over the country. I will start by giving a major thank you to our 2 premier sponsors for this event. Please join me in giving a round of applause for Cass County Electric Cooperative and Xcel Energy. Thank you to both of our businesses for your engagement in this event series and elevating the reach and impact of this critical conversation. Thank you to our gold sponsors, Otter Tail Power Company and Alltag. Our media sponsors, Inforum, KFGO, and MWC Advertising of Fargo-Moorhead. Our silver sponsors, AM 1100 The Flag, Ellingson Companies, iDigital, Minnesota State University Moorhead, Prairie Business Magazine, Primacy Strategy Group, and WDIY. Our corporate sponsors, Bank of North Dakota, Border States, Eide Bailly, Lignite Energy Council, and North Dakota State University. We have a phenomenal event production sponsor with Livewire. Thank you all at Livewire, the team. It truly is spectacular to work with. Our photography sponsor, 5'20" Design Lounge, and the event sponsor, Delta by Marriott. The impact of this event reaches far beyond just the leaders in the room, as I've mentioned. We are working alongside 31 other chambers of commerce and associations across the Midwest. This is the most partners that we've had in the history of the Midwest Summits. I'm also really privileged to have my great friend Brecca Kramer here from the Minot Chamber in person. We really do value the partnership that we have with all of these organizations. Thanks to these partnerships and Forum Communications for hosting this live stream on their news sites across over 20 markets. Our last summit reached over 7,000 viewers live streamed. Today, our goal is to break that record. Thank you to all our sponsors and co-hosts for your support with this important event. We are incredibly fortunate to have a fantastic community and region that steps up and supports events like this. Please, let's give one more round of applause to all of our sponsors. Now I would like to welcome to the stage one of our premier sponsors for today's program, Marshall Albright, the President and CEO of Cass County Electric Cooperative.
This is your region. These are your resources. This is your reliable, affordable, cleaner than ever electricity. We're all in on all of the above energy.
Well, thank you, Shannon, and good morning, everyone. And thank you for attending the Midwest Energy Summit, both virtually and in person. Cass County Electric Cooperative has been electrifying southeast North Dakota for the past 86 years, starting in Kindred, North Dakota by electrifying the rural areas. Today, we provide electric service to more than 58,000 accounts in a territory in southeast North Dakota, serving rural areas, small towns, and large cities. We take great pride in serving our members with reliable and affordable electricity. The cooperative operates a high-tech electric distribution system that integrates leading-edge technology to provide excellent service to our membership. The technology investments and employee dedication have resulted in nation-leading service reliability. Our members are powered by North Dakota's energy resources from Minn Kota Power Cooperative. I'm proud to say that our electricity costs have remained flat for the past 6 years despite impacts of inflation. Our stable costs can also be attributed to low-cost coal, hydropower, and wind resources from North Dakota, and the efficient operation of Minn Kota Power and Cass County Electric Cooperatives. I'm excited to hear about the information to be shared this morning on geopolitics, transportation landscape, the future of hydrogen, and carbon capture utilization and storage. Transitioning our country from carbon-based fuel emissions will take time, and potentially decades, and a lot of money. Transportation will need revolutionary technological advances in batteries and other no-carbon fuels to ensure we can travel when and where we want to at an affordable cost. Regarding power supply, federal policy is America's most significant threat to reliability. The North American Reliability Corporation, or NERC as a lot of you might know it, recently published a reliability assessment and said that more than half of the United States is at risk of electricity shortages this winter due to regional generation shortfalls, increased demand for power, and potential fuel delivery challenges. And sometimes the pipelines do have insufficient supply to serve all the generation in certain areas, especially in the winter. So what are the options to look at improving grid reliability? We must be pragmatic in retiring existing baseload power supply until we have viable alternatives. Carbon capture and storage technology, when proven successful, will allow us to continue to use fossil fuel generating plants until zero carbon emission alternatives are developed and become available. And that could be decades away as well. The grid will need substantial investments, maybe billions, in transmission lines to improve power from one region, to move power from one region to another, allowing more renewable energy to integrate to the grid. I'm sharing this information this morning because our nation faces looming grid challenges and reliability challenges while electric demand continues to soar. Ultimately, we must keep the lights on in our industry with dispatchable, always available energy, especially baseload power. I look forward to a great energy discussion this morning to address some of the issues I talked about. And with that, let's move on to the program. So this morning, I am pleased to introduce our first guest speaker, Christopher Guth, to kick off the 2023 Midwest Energy Summit. Christopher is the Senior Vice President of the U.S. Chamber of Global's Energy Institute. He leads the nation's institute efforts to build support for meaningful energy and environmental action, nationally and internationally, through policy development, education, and advocacy. The Institute has attracted grassroots advocates nationwide supporting its efforts to capitalize on America's tremendous energy promise. Guth offered expertise on an array of energy and environmental issues. He educates policymakers, businesses, energy stakeholders, coalitions, and the public about the importance of diversified energy portfolio and how it can ensure an efficient, reliable, prosperous, and secure energy future. Before joining the U.S. Chamber in 2008, Guth served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Nuclear Energy at the U.S. Department of Energy, where he developed the administration's nuclear policies and coordinated the department's interactions with the media, key stakeholders, and Congress. Please welcome Christopher Guth to the stage.
Good morning. Thank you, Marshall. And thanks, Shannon and the Chamber for the invite. I'm very happy to be here. I spoke here virtually a couple years ago. It's not quite the same as actually seeing the faces and hearing the groans sometimes. So I work at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We exist essentially to be the voice of business to the federal government, whether it be the administration or whether it be Congress. And so I spend a lot of time working with Congress and the administration. But we can't do what we do without the support of state and local chambers, harnessing your voices, the employers out in the real world, and then funneling them back to DC to help members of Congress understand how the policies impact local businesses. So I thank Shannon and the chamber here because there's very few chambers across the country who aren't better partners. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a scene setter going into the rest of the morning, talk a little bit about federal policy, talk a little bit about the geopolitics of energy and kind of where we are, and you have a great agenda after that. So energy security in the age of energy transition. It's kind of important that we're finally back to discussing them simultaneously, because up until the invasion of Ukraine, the discussion was predominantly looking at energy transition, and a lot of folks thought that they could forget about energy security. And then everybody was reminded, especially the EU, that you can never forget about energy security because that's when the lights don't work, that's when the heat doesn't work, and that's when people start to get really upset. So a little bit of an overview. Where are we within the grand scheme of energy? Prices have been very, very erratic over the last 3 or 4 years. Obviously, COVID had a lot to do with that, but then the instability within geopolitics has overshadowed that even more recently. Global uncertainty, kind of the same thing. You saw Europe commit to essentially switching on a dime, going from being 60% dependent upon imported Russian energy, specifically oil and gas, but also coal and uranium, to going down to essentially zero within a matter of 2 or 3 years. They're not quite there yet, but they've made most of the way there, and that's pretty impressive when you consider how big the energy economy in the EU is. Historic underinvestment. Now, within the oil and gas space, which fuel our economy, it takes a couple of years for an investment in a new exploration to actually result in a drop of oil or a therm of gas showing up to market. And what we saw during COVID was the entire industry didn't know what tomorrow was going to look like. You saw roughly 10% of the entire oil and gas workforce laid off in this country, and you saw CEOs and boards pulling way back on investment in new exploration and production. This wasn't obviously just in the United States, it was around the world. We saw between 2020 and 2022 levels of investment that, when adjusted for inflation, were roughly on par with the 1960s, even though our global economy has grown exponentially since then. What that means is we're in that space now where the investments that would have been made in 2020, 2021 would be yielding new product now. But since those investments weren't made at the level that were necessary, we've seen persistent undersupply. Now, obviously, if you look at the price of oil, the price of gas day to day, there's a lot of other influences, but it's a persistent trend that we're having to deal with. Thankfully, the shale industry in the US is one of the most nimble oil and gas industries in the world, and they've been able to bring on additional supply that was not necessarily forecasted in a very short period of time, which has helped insulate the United States in a way that other countries don't have. Massive congressional investment. I mean, I'll get to that more later, but it's having a profound impact on the overall energy landscape. And then you can't forget regulatory tsunami. I mean, I think it's fair to say that this is the most regulatory aggressive administration in the history of government, period. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we go on. So let's just start off with something that we probably all learned in kindergarten, playing on the monkey bars. When you're hanging there and you're going down the ladder, you can't let go of the rung you're hanging on until you have a firm grasp on the next one. And that's sort of the energy transition. The International Energy Agency has essentially said that we have maybe 50% of the technologies necessary to transition the global economy to net zero or no greenhouse gas emissions, but we still need the other 50%. Now, that doesn't mean you don't exploit the 50% we have, but what it does mean is until that other 50% materializes, you can't just magically transition away from having any emissions. And we're sort of, at 50%, we're sort of touching that next rung, but we don't have a firm grasp. So when you let go of the one you're on, what happens? You fall. And that's kind of what the EU did, was they wished themselves towards net zero, forgetting that at the end of the day, energy security is about electrons and molecules. And they were sadly reminded about that when Russia invaded Ukraine. We have a sort of saying that we try to instill in people is that the transition can't go any faster than the pace of innovation. Innovation is the key to all of this. The good news is that there's overwhelming consensus across science and engineering what those technologies are probably going to be. There are things like hydrogen, there are things like advanced nuclear, there are things like CCUS, there are things like storage, all things that we're going to talk about today. But like I said, you can't let go of the rung you're on until you have the next one. So threats and opportunities right now. Threats, regulatory tsunami, I've already mentioned that once and I'll say it again. Activist courts, judges, especially at the federal level, appointed for lifetime terms. increasingly deciding that they're going to make law instead of arbitrate the law that's already there. And then permitting. It doesn't get enough coverage, but if you haven't noticed, it's become increasingly difficult, if not in some cases impossible, to build things in this country. There's some areas where it's worse than others, and I'll get into that, but at the end of the day, it's a huge threat to keeping our economy competitive. Of course, there's opportunities. I mentioned the federal investment. I mean, the passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS and Science Act, and then ultimately the Inflation Reduction Act. They're going to have profound impacts on our physical economy, especially within the energy space, because that's where most of it was centered. Permitting reform, I mentioned it's a problem. Well, we're seeing this increasing bipartisan agreement that it is a problem. And so when you have the likes of Ted Cruz and Elizabeth Warren both saying that we need to fix this, well, kind of cooking with gas, and that's something I can work with. I mean, obviously, they're coming at it from different vantage points, but you're not going to get any actual permitting reform unless you have 60 votes in the US Senate, and that means having to sit down and compromise. LNG expansion. The role of gas around the world is increasing. The role of US as a supplier to the global economy is increasing. We are now the largest exporter in the world. We're also the largest producer, so it's kind of having our cake and eat it too. We have some of the cheapest natural gas prices in the world because we produce so much here, and we have enough left over to ship around the world, help our allies, and actually make some money. And ultimately, renewable growth. I mean, there's been a huge policy focus for the last 20 years on building out renewables, and that's having a significant impact on the grid, and it's also having a significant impact on where, or the pace, I should say, of decarbonization. So let's get into some of the details here. Permitting reform. You know, at the federal level, it takes roughly 5 years to go through the permitting process. Now, it shouldn't take longer to permit a project than it does to build a project. I mean, it took roughly 3 years to build the Hoover Dam. And now we're sitting at a point where, on average, it's 5 years. When it comes to things like interstate transmission lines and interstate natural gas pipelines, it's become virtually impossible to permit them. I mean, we haven't seen a new interstate natural gas pipeline happen without a direct intervention from Congress in a very long time. Now, like I said, we're the largest producer of gas in the world, but we can't necessarily get volumes of gas from where it's produced to where it needs to be without additional transmission, and that's becoming a problem. Same thing on the electrical transmission side. As we build out more and more renewables, you need massive amounts of transmission. The National Academies of Science estimate that in order to get to net zero, it's going to take roughly another 1 million miles of transmission line. No one believes that's possible under the current process. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm somewhat hopeful, because environmental activists have used the permitting process for years, both in the agencies as well as in the courts, to stop projects they don't like, things like nuclear or coal, oil and gas. Well, now chickens are coming home to roost. The same process is stopping the renewable build-out that they want and they need to get to their goals of net zero. And so all of a sudden, there's this, both sides agreeing this process is broken and we need to fix it. The NEPA, which is the sort of governing structural law that the federal government uses to go through the permitting process, the National Environmental Policy Act, it was passed about 52 years ago. And until June, it hadn't been amended by Congress once. And that was part of the debt ceiling deal. It was a major step. It wasn't the biggest changes, but it was the first time Congress actually did it. And it showed that there is this bipartisan support and there's bipartisan momentum. There's a lot more that needs to be done, and that's one of the reasons why permitting reform is one of our top priorities at the federal level. The 3 laws that I talked about, together, they're estimated to account for roughly $2 trillion of federal investment. And obviously that's going to be leveraged by the private sector, probably something on the order of 3 or 4 or 5 to 1. So you're talking about something on the order of $6, maybe even $10 trillion over a 10-year period going into building things, going in to build infrastructure, roads, bridges, ports, going in to build the entire energy economy out, going to build new microchip manufacturing for semiconductors, trying to reshore that capability to this country. Those are all great things and something that could not only keep us competitive, but keep us dominant globally from an economic standpoint. The problem is we can't build anything. Looking just at the Inflation Reduction Act, the energy portion, we'll leave the corporate tax increase and the prescription price controls off to the side. That Wall Street estimates that's roughly $1.4 trillion over a 10-year period. Now, a professor at Princeton estimates that if that law is fully implemented, it would result in a reduction of greenhouse gases of roughly 50% from where they were in 2005, which is kind of the base year, which happens to be exactly what President Biden committed to 2 years ago at the UN climate convention. But the professor also said that without permitting reform, he doesn't see any more than 20% of that being implemented. So then you go from $1.4 trillion to something significantly less. Permitting reform needs to happen so that we can get these things built, especially for energy-producing states like North Dakota. Being able to bring the largesse of what's coming out of the Bakken to the entire region is going to take, to maximize that, it's going to take additional infrastructure. And right now, that's a problem. Like I said, LNG expansion, another great opportunity. The greenhouse gas intensity, meaning that when it finally gets to the burner tip and it burns, and the amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted throughout the entire process from wellhead to burner tip is the lowest in the world. Which is to say, not all gas is gas. Molecularly, it's the same, but the infrastructure that brings it to market is not the same. The Department of Energy, the US government, estimated that if Europe were to replace all of the natural gas it was importing from Russia with US gas, it would result in a 40% decrease in greenhouse gas emissions. Now, is that zero? No. But 40% is a lot, and that's a huge step forward just by switching it out from responsibly produced gas in the US to Soviet-era infrastructure in Russia that leaks like a sieve. So it's a huge benefit for us because not only are we helping reduce global greenhouse gases, but all that economic investment is happening here. It's happening in the Gulf of Mexico, it's happening in Marcellus, it's happening up here in the Bakken. Those are jobs and investment here, which is a lot different than it was 20 years ago when most of our money was going to OPEC countries and that investment was happening there and we were paying for it. So now the shoe's on the other foot and it's a win-win. Economic growth, greenhouse gas reduction. Renewable growth. Renewable growth has happened in fits and spurts, but basically in an exponential trend. First wind in the early 2000s and increasingly solar. But the part that a lot of people sometimes forget is renewables are intermittent. Until there's a storage solution, they can't necessarily replace baseload one for one. And that's why natural gas is so important in this country. It's the backbone of a clean energy economy. Not only has it allowed us to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by almost 30%, leading the world. No one has reduced greenhouse gases more than the United States since 2005. And that's fundamentally because we went from predominantly burning coal to predominantly burning gas. Gas is roughly 50% of the greenhouse gas intensity, huge drop off. But gas is even more important than that. As we see these, the peaker plants, meaning they're not always running full speed, but they're there and they can ramp up very quickly, that enables more and more renewables to come on the grid. Because at the end of the day, the grid needs to be perfectly stable. You can't have more demand than supply, otherwise you get instability, and sometimes you see transformers explode, and that's when the lights go out. So when all of a sudden an unpredicted weather system happens and wind generation drops significantly, or the solar intensity is not what was expected, and solar generation drops, those peaker plants pop on and keep the grid stable. Without gas, you cannot have renewables. Otherwise, you don't have reliability. And ultimately, that's what we need and we want. We also need affordability too, but reliability is always number one. But without gas, we can't have more renewables. And finally, hydrogen. Hydrogen is kind of like, it's like the Swiss Army knife of energy solutions. It has applications in the industrial space, switching out methane or natural gas for hydrogen. It has applications in the transportation space. Obviously, electric vehicles are growing within our market at a steady, if not underwhelming pace. But electric batteries don't really work that well with like long-haul trucking. Batteries are really heavy, and that makes it more difficult, less efficient to move things long distances. Batteries also don't really work well for heavy machinery where you need like massive amounts of torque. And batteries really have a mixed review when it comes to energy storage. So we have all of this growing renewable generation, and sometimes it's happening when demand's not there. The greatest example is California. California has subsidized rooftop solar over the years, and they have massive amounts of generation in the middle of the day when it's sunny. Well, what's happening in the middle of the day? We're all at work. We're all gathered in big buildings like this, which is much more efficient than each one of us being in separate residences consuming our own. But that's when they're generating all this electricity. So what do they have to do? I remember I told you how the grid has to be stable. They pay Arizona and Nevada to take those electrons, which is a great deal if you're Arizona or Nevada. You not only get the electron you need to deliver to your customers, but you get paid for it. Well, that's unsustainable. But what would happen if we could hook electrolyzers up to that generation during the day when the demand's low and we don't necessarily need the electrons it's generating, and turn water into hydrogen, and then store that hydrogen indefinitely. And then at night, when obviously solar's not working, you could theoretically move that hydrogen through existing upgraded natural gas infrastructure to natural gas power plants and burn that hydrogen to create the electricity. Well, then you kind of have de facto storage. And that's a way to essentially, potentially, make renewables de facto baseload. And the beauty of it is when you burn that hydrogen, it doesn't have that C molecule, the carbon molecule in it, the way that natural gas does, so there's no greenhouse gas emissions. Now, there's a long way to go, and we're going to have a whole panel on hydrogen, but it represents a huge opportunity for our economy and what we can build here spread around the world. Congressional investment. I talked about those three laws: the Inflation Reduction Act, CHIPS and Science Act, Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. I talked about it within the context of permitting, but they represent a huge opportunity. I mean, DC gets a correct viewpoint from most Americans that it's more partisan than ever. Now, obviously, there's not duels being fought on the Senate floor the way they were after the Civil War, thankfully. But some days, it looks like it's going to get pretty close. But sometimes they actually come together and do things that are good for America. They don't get as much coverage because it's not as sexy. I mean, the news wants to cover the things that are confrontational. But those three laws are pretty impressive. Now, the Inflation Reduction Act, by definition, was partisan because it included the tax increases and the prescription drug price controls. But if you look at the climate and the energy space, it looks a whole lot like a bipartisan compromise. And at the end of the day, that's really what it was, because the gentleman who wrote it, Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia, he comes from a coal state, he comes from a natural gas state, he comes from a manufacturing state. And so the president had proposed all stick, meaning we want to decarbonize the economy, so let's put all these regulations in place and all these penalties. And ultimately, Congress rejected that, largely because Chairman Manchin stood his ground. And he said, there's another way to do it. Let's create carrots. Let's incentivize investment in these technologies that we know we need to bring them to market, to make our economy stronger, and then take those technologies around the world. We'll see how it works, because like I said, without permanent reform, we're not going to go very far. But right now, we're seeing hundreds of billions of dollars flowing into these technologies, things like hydrogen, things like CCUS, things like advanced nuclear. So we'll have to see what things look like in 5 years and 10 years. But right now, it's hard not to be more optimistic than ever before, just given the policy and the private sector investment and will coming together to move the country forward. Now the threats, regulatory tsunami. When I say that this administration is more aggressive than any others, that's no joke. I mean, empirically, it's not even close. If you look at the number of major rules that this administration has proposed, it's almost double what the Obama administration did over the same amount of time. And most of us looked at the Obama administration as the most aggressive in history. But they're kind of minor league compared to where this administration is. We see efficiency regs proposed. You say, great, efficiency is phenomenal. Of course, we should make our processes more efficient so that we can go about the same amount of economic production and consume less energy. Well, they've taken it a step further and said this means that we should perhaps ban natural gas ranges, ban natural gas furnaces, ban natural gas water heaters. That's not really about efficiency anymore. This is about trying to eradicate natural gas and electrify everything. Now, maybe we are going to be there in 30 or 40 years, but right now we're not. And that conversion is significantly expensive, more expensive, and it's something that most Americans don't want to shoulder. Power plant rule. So they've proposed a rule, they haven't finalized it yet, that would require, in order for natural gas plants to remain open, existing, or to build a new one, by roughly 2033, 2035, they would have to be able to either have carbon capture and effectively capturing 80% of the CO2, which is not a technology that has been demonstrated at that scale. There's a couple of projects, one in Canada, one in Houston, but they're the first of a kind, and they're mired with problems, and it's going to take a while until industry gets to that point of being able to capture 80%. Or co-fire with hydrogen, roughly at the same percentage, 80%. I mean, we don't have hydrogen infrastructure just yet. And the utilities are just starting to experiment with mixing natural gas and hydrogen together and sticking it into a boiler at a combined cycle natural gas plant. And this administration is saying that if our existing natural gas fleet is going to remain producing electricity, the largest source of electricity that we have, it's going to have to get over this technology curve in about a decade. It's just, it's almost not even, it's so far-fetched that it's almost not worth discussing, other than the fact that it's on the table and it's what this administration has proposed. Particulate matter. This is one of those issues that it's really difficult to explain to people. It sounds so boring, but it has such a huge impact on the economy. Particulate matter is really, really tiny emissions that come from industrial sources, from burning things. And the Clean Air Act regulates it like it does mercury or NOx and SOx. And the Clean Air Act has been one of the crown jewels of the United States. You know, back in the 60s, we had some of the worst air in the world. Congress came together in a bipartisan way, passed the Clean Air Act. It allows for predictability for the most part. And lo and behold, 50 years later, the United States has the cleanest air in the world. No joke. Houston has cleaner air than Paris. LA has cleaner air than Tokyo. And it's because of the Clean Air Act. Well, the problem is that it's been so successful, we're down to that point where you're bleeding a rock. It's, as you engineers know, trying to remove the first 10% is infinitely easier than trying to remove the last 1%. Because then you really have to solve for a technological problem. And that's kind of where we are with particulate matter. And they proposed a rule, a range of lowering this emission that would put roughly a third of the country in what they call non-attainment, meaning it's not complying with the standards the federal government has proposed. Now, when you're in non-attainment, you go to Clean Air Act jail. Now, what does that mean? Well, first, it means EPA can withhold federal highway dollars. Now, remember I told you about this bipartisan infrastructure bill, which was a once-in-a-generation investment in surface transportation. But if you're in non-attainment, EPA can say, nope, you don't get this. The second thing that happens is it becomes significantly more difficult to get a Clean Air Act permit to build something new. So we just passed these 3 bills, $2 trillion to build stuff. But then all of a sudden, potentially we have a third to 40% of the country in non-attainment, and when they want to build stuff, they're on a budget, which means, okay, I'm a patriot and I know I can make money off of building a semiconductor manufacturing facility, but I'm in a non-attainment area. So in order to get the Clean Air Act permit, I have to figure out what my emissions are going to be, and then I have to find a way to remove the same amount of emissions from the area, which normally means buying a manufacturing facility, shutting it down to build a new one. I mean, it's asinine, especially at this point when we've already reduced these emissions. And the part that's even worse is the leading cause of particulate matter has nothing to do with industry. It comes from wildfires. And so it's something you can't even really control. I mean, obviously you can do controlled burns and try and manage forestry, but it's not something that, you know, a county supervisor or a governor has a lot of control over. But they're in this Clean Air Act jail. SEC climate disclosure, this is something that applies to almost all businesses, whether you're privately held or publicly traded. They haven't finalized it yet, but they've suggested that every business is going to have to report on Scope 1, Scope 2, and potentially Scope 3 emissions, meaning all the emissions that you generate conducting your business, and then all the emissions that happen with your products once they go into the market. I mean, the amount of money it's going to cost to comply with this, just from how do we figure this out, how do we report it, which office in the company even is responsible for it, that alone is going to be significant, let alone the impacts it might have. There's definitely a fear from some smart environmentalists that if a company operates under this system, they're going to be less likely to make commitments to invest in clean energy. Because if they fall short, then someone's going to sue them because they didn't meet their requirement under the SEC disclosure rule. So why invest at all? We're in a really unique time, a really opportune time, but we need your help in DC. So when there's opportunities to interact with your delegations, I mean, obviously the North Dakota delegation from an energy state is rock solid, but they still need some help. They need to hear about how it's difficult to permit things. They need to hear about how reliability could be jeopardized with some of these proposals so that they can take those arguments to the floor of the Senate and the House and to the administration. And in Minnesota, where you have a divided delegation, they need to hear it even more because they're getting talking points from within their own caucus, but they need to hear from the employers in their district what these policies can or can't do. They need to understand realism when it comes to electrons and molecules and not just aspirations. So again, thank you very much for the invitation today. I look forward to the rest of the panel. It's going to be a lot of fun. Have a good morning.
Now introducing North Dakota State Senator David Hogue.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Well, good morning to all of you. I wanted to take a moment to, first of all, say thank you to Shannon Full and Cale Dunwoody and the rest of the Chamber team for taking a leadership role in this policy summit, and especially one that's near and dear to many legislators, which is an energy policy. As many of you know, in the legislature, we meet, to the disappointment of a lot of people, only once every 2 years. and it's for a 4-month period. And in between that 20-month period in between legislative sessions, we call that our interim. And the interim period of time is when we are supposed to be educating ourselves about existing policy and where policy should be going into the future. And so it's policy summits like this one that help us with our objective for staying up to speed on energy policy and other policies that we endeavor to regulate in the legislative session. So thank you to Shannon and the entire chamber team. This morning, we're going to kick it off with our first panel, and it relates to transportation. As we all know, energy has a profound impact on the way goods are transported and people travel across the country and around the world. This morning's first panel will feature transportation and supply chain experts who highlight the integration of existing and future methods of powering transportation while outlining the feasibility of integrating these methods throughout the Midwest. Today, we will be joined on stage by panelists who will provide a variety of perspectives on the transportation industry. The moderator for today's first panel is Lieutenant Governor Tammy Miller. Lieutenant Governor Miller is well known to me because she presides over the North Dakota Senate. She does a good job of keeping us on task. I know her as Madam President, but she's our 39th Lieutenant Governor. She, before she was the Lieutenant Governor, she was the Chief Operating Officer for Governor Burgum, and before that, she was the CEO of Border States Electric. So please help me welcome Lieutenant Governor Tammy Miller and the rest of the panel.
Morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to be with you at this Midwest Energy Summit. Energy and transportation are two areas I'm extremely passionate about. Before we get into the panel, I too would like to thank the Chamber and my old friends at Xcel Energy and Cass County Electric. Great to see you both. Thanks for your sponsorship. Very good friends and good customers of Border States. I'd also like to introduce our Commerce Commissioner, Josh Teigen. Josh, stand up, please. And I'd also like to recognize all of the legislators in the room. Would you all please stand up? I've seen some, in addition to Senator Hogue. So thank you for being here. Thanks for your service and your support. As I said, energy and transportation are two important topics. Transportation is so important for our supply chains, our economy, and our quality of life. And we know here in North Dakota, we like to say we feed and fuel the world. Energy is so extremely important to our quality of life and our state budget. Let's not forget how much of our revenue comes from energy. Pays for a lot of our schools, roads, water projects, flood protection, etc. So extremely, extremely important. And our governor has set forth a goal to be carbon neutral by 2030. We're making great progress. We're going to do that with innovation and not regulation. We're excited today to hear from our panelists, to hear what their goals are and what they're doing to help us with this goal. So let's get into this. Let's dive into our panel discussion. I'm excited to introduce Jeff Davidman, Vice President of State and Local Government Affairs at Delta Airlines, Mike Swaney, Director of Advanced Energy Innovation, BNSF, and Denver Tolliver, who is with us from the Upper Great Plains Transportation Institute. With that, I'm going to sit down and have each of them do a quick introduction. Go ahead, Jeff.
Well, thank you, Lieutenant Governor, and good morning, everybody. Again, I'm Jeff Davidman, the Vice President of State and Local Government Affairs for Delta Airlines. Delta has a really large presence throughout the Midwest, including here in North Dakota, where we're the largest carrier, serving Fargo and Grand Forks and Bismarck and Williston and Minot, and then obviously in Minnesota, we're the largest carrier there as well, with actually our second largest hub in the world operating at Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport. So great to be here. Looking forward to the discussion today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. Mike Swaney, BNSF Railway. We are the largest railroad in the western two-thirds of the U.S. And Lieutenant Governor, it's fitting you mentioned that you feed and fuel the world. I was looking at our stats last night. We originate about 311,000 rail cars out of the state of North Dakota. And if you look at it, it's about 60% agriculture, 40% industrial products. So very fitting and proud to be able to support the state of North Dakota with our active presence here of about 1,100 employees. I'll get into some of the details later, but I'll just say at a high level, BNSF, 32,500 route miles in the western two-thirds of the U.S. We operate a fleet of about 6,000 locomotives. So for us, this whole topic of transportation and alternative fuels and emissions reduction is part and parcel of what I do on a daily basis. Excited to partner with the state of North Dakota. I was talking to Josh last night. We were debating whether Texas is the North Dakota of the South or North Dakota is the Texas of the North. Either way, I think we're kindred spirits. I'm excited to be here and looking forward to the panel.
Thank you, Mike. Denver.
I'm Denver Tolliver, Director of the Upper Great Plains Transportation Institute at North Dakota State University. We are an interdisciplinary research institute established by the legislature in 1967. We have a very broad research portfolio spanning most of the surface transportation modes and airports as well. Some of our research does relate to energy and environmental analysis, which I'll be talking about in greater detail later on. But many of you may recognize the name and associate it with the biennial road and bridge infrastructure studies, where each biennium we estimate the investments statewide in county, township, and local roads and report that to the North Dakota legislature. So very excited to be on this panel and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, and thank you again to our panelists for being with us. We're going to start off with a couple of general questions for each panelist, and then we'll dive into some that are more unique for their specific industries. So why don't we start with Jeff responding to share highlights of your environmental goals as they relate to transportation, and how has your strategy evolved over the decades? And are there some obstacles that are preventing you from accelerating that strategy?
Well, thanks for the question. So Delta Airlines has a goal of getting to net zero by 2050. And we're doing a lot of different things to get there. We're putting sustainability in really everything that we do. But when we look at our carbon footprint, 98% of that carbon footprint is actually what happens in the air, not on the ground. So we can electrify our airport equipment, and we're doing that, and remove single-use plastics off the aircraft, and we're doing that. But we really, in order to tackle the biggest challenge that we have to look at what's going on in the sky and when we fly. And so as we look at that and look at that strategy, we know we can get to our goal by 25% of that goal can be accomplished by renewal of the fleet, so getting more fuel-efficient fleets into our fleet by 2050. We know that we can fly a little bit differently working with our partners at the FAA, and that's sort of 3 to 5% of that goal. But 70% of that goal is really looking at and using sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF as we'll refer to it as today. And for those that don't know what SAF is, it's a drop-in fuel that today can be blended 50% SAF and 50% with traditional jet fuel. You can blend that together, and then under the safety precaution, the ASTM standards, it can fly in the engine today. The other great thing about it is it can use the existing infrastructure. So the same way we get traditional jet fuel to the airports, we can do that as well with SAF. We can put it on the plane the same way as well. SAF, by definition, has to have a minimum of a 50% greenhouse gas emission reduction to it, and we know that some SAF can get all the way to 80%. So it seems like this great new product that everyone's excited about, and we are, that there is one big problem with it. There's only 15 million gallons that were produced in 2022 in the US. To put that in context, 15 million gallons for Delta Airlines alone, we'd be able to operate our fleet for maybe 1 or 2 days. And for the entire US airline industry, who's also looking at SAF, it wouldn't even last a day to be able to do that. So what we have is a great solution in SAF, but it's not scaled at the levels that we need to get it to. So as I'm looking forward to talking more about today, that's really our focus, is how do we establish this market that not only will help from a sustainability standpoint, but from an energy independence standpoint, as well as from an economic development standpoint.
Are any other countries ahead of us on SAF?
Everyone is working together, but no, there's not a leader out there yet, which is a great opportunity for the United States. It's a great opportunity for the Midwest region to lead as well. Europe is working on it, other places around the globe are, but there isn't that leader yet. We think the leader can be the United States, and it can be right here in the Midwest.
In North Dakota.
In North Dakota.
Thank you. Mike?
Yeah, so similar parallel to Jeff, just a couple stats. I mentioned those 6,000 locomotives. What that equates to for BNSF is about 1.2 billion gallons of diesel that we consume annually. BNSF's got a target to reduce our emissions 30% by the year 2030, and that's off of a 2018 baseline. And the way we'll get there is largely through emissions reduction in our locomotive fuel burn. So the way we think we'll get there is primarily two different components. One is going to be renewable diesel. So we're about halfway through a 3-year pilot with one of our primary locomotive manufacturers to understand the impact of burning different blends of renewable diesel in our engine. We love the fact that it's a drop-in replacement, right? So minimal blending infrastructure that you have to do on the ground. But I love all the comments I've heard over the last 12, 24 hours about a natural transition, not trying to do something artificial, not trying to grab the next rung, as Chris said, before we've or not letting go before we grab the next rung. So we see renewable and biodiesel as kind of the first step to move toward that 30% reduction. The other piece is fuel efficiency measures. When you think about the way we operate trains and the aerodynamics of how we build trains. And then also there's an interesting thing about locomotive traction technology where we're undergoing a shift there. But those are all the things that'll get us to the 30 by 30 goal. And then in my role, this group called Advanced Energy Innovation, we're looking beyond 2030 to say, how does battery electric, how does hydrogen, how do hybrids and other technologies get us to something beyond a 30% reduction? As far as challenges, I think, as I mentioned, kind of making sure we're moving at the pace of innovation. I love what I'm hearing about, North Dakota and the fact that you place a premium on innovation. That's what I get to do day to day. And so making sure we don't try to artificially wave a magic wand and implement technology that doesn't exist. Let's let the industry decide the most effective and efficient way to get there. I think that's the opportunity we've got.
Thank you. Denver?
Yes, I'll talk a little bit broadly about maybe some highway and transportation goals. If you have not heard the acronym ZEV, you will become very familiar with it, and that means zero emission vehicle, and that is our stated national goal for highway transportation. How soon we get to that, if we get to that ever, is sort of the transition that we're talking about. California is aggressively pursuing zero emission vehicles. In fact, starting in 2036, equipment manufacturers will not be able to sell anything other than a zero emission vehicle. I do need to clarify what zero emission vehicle means. It means zero tailpipe emissions. It does not necessarily mean that the vehicle, that the electricity that powers the vehicle was produced with no emissions. However, the longer-term goal is an entirely green energy chain that may be achievable at some time way in the future. It may not, but if we start from the tailpipe and back up, as far as California is concerned, then they're looking at greener ways of producing the electricity, and of course, they're big in solar, they're big in wind, and they're big in other areas. So I'll just give that as an overview about how the environmental goals have changed. Christopher did a great job of talking about NEPA and how NEPA has evolved over the years and what is actually meant, and the emission regulations associated with NEPA. And I'll talk a little bit about those in detail later on.
Thank you. Would any of the three of you want to discuss how advanced battery technology and storage technology is impacting your strategies?
Yeah, I'll weigh in on that because in 2021, BNSF tested a 2.4 megawatt hour battery electric locomotive. So it's something we have experience with, and I would say it's certainly one of the top three technologies that we're looking at in terms of what a shift away from diesel might look like for rail. One of the challenges, though, I mentioned that 2.4 megawatt hour, that's the size of the battery. Locomotives today have a fuel tank that holds about 5,000 gallons of diesel. Right, so not to geek out here, but 5,000 gallons of diesel equates to about 200 megawatt hours of energy. Okay, now the efficiency of a diesel engine, you're going to get about 40% of that. So 80 megawatt hours. Just remember 80 as your available energy. The battery electric locomotive that we tested was just over 2. So that shows you the scale that we have to go. You know how far we've got to go to get there. So what we're doing is looking for targeted applications as energy density improves, as different types of battery chemistries are brought to market. Certainly as the economics come down, there's a lot of focus on the automobile sector, understandably, not as much in the industrial off-road space. But I would say battery certainly is a compelling opportunity for us in the right application. So we're eagerly testing and partnering with our major locomotive manufacturers in that space.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything on that, Jeff?
No.
Okay.
Not for me.
Okay, we'll move on to the next general question, and it relates to economics. How would you describe the volatility of markets for low-carbon fuels, and how does the volatility influence your organization's decisions to pursue new and existing environmental goals?
You want me to go first? Okay.
Go ahead.
So, certainly, when we look at feedstocks that go into making SAF, we're talking about corn and soybeans and other type of feedstocks. And although the prices of those feedstocks can certainly fluctuate, it's certainly less volatile than traditional fossil fuels that OPEC may be controlling the supply and demand side from it. So we view it as a less volatile component than maybe traditional jet in that regard. But the price is a challenge with sustainable aviation fuel because it's so early in its development. As I said, only 15 million gallons made today, and right now, sustainable aviation fuel is trading sort of 2 to 3 times higher than traditional jet fuel. And so part of our challenge as we develop this industry is trying to get those prices back closer to parity with traditional jet fuel. And so that, our hope is over time, as the industry develops, those prices will come down. But also, thanks to federal and state policies, they can play an important role and are playing an important role in that part of it as well.
Thank you. Anything to add, Denver?
Yes, just on the trucking side, the volatility of diesel fuel has been a real concern. As a percentage of trucking cost per mile, it may range from 12 to 18%. BNSF and Delta can purchase in very large quantities and go into the future markets. The trucker cannot do that. And so the volatility of diesel has been a real issue over time. In terms of renewable diesel, California solved the problem out there because of their low carbon standards and incentive programs. And so renewable diesel is tracking diesel very closely in California, and that's having no impact on the penetration of renewable diesel in the California market. However, outside of California and Oregon, big difference right now between the price of renewable diesel and the price of diesel at the pump. And as you were saying, that fluctuates a great deal with conditions in the market and also feedstock supplies and agricultural and environmental conditions.
Thank you. Now we'll dive into some very specific questions. First for you, Mike, tell us what new methods you are looking at to fuel locomotives.
Yeah, so several. We've got a variety of options at our disposal, and I mentioned the 3-year test on renewable and biodiesel blends. As we think about what a transition might look like for our locomotive fleet, we've got a couple things that we've got to consider. Not only the size of the fleet, But the fact that we operate these locomotives for oftentimes 50 years, and a mainline locomotive today would get cascaded down. So it will go through a couple overhauls, last about 20 years as a mainline locomotive, then become more of a regional locomotive, and ultimately end its life as a switcher operating in yards, right? So it's not a conversion that we would look to flip the switch and tomorrow all of a sudden we're operating new locomotives. We'd have to time the implementation of a new fuel with the natural conversion of our locomotive fleet. So that said, going with a solution that's a drop-in replacement, as you mentioned, SAF, renewable and biodiesel in our case, is obviously the most compelling opportunity. That said, what we're looking at in terms of others, I mentioned the battery electric locomotive. Certainly, as you think about the capacity that you can put on board today and the effective range, again, I mentioned it's really got a sweet spot of where you could really operate a battery electric locomotive. Challenge I might point to there, though, is I'm glad everybody in this room is thinking about it and talking about it, is, particularly in states like California, where we have a switcher fleet of probably 50, 60 locomotives. If we were to convert them all to battery electric tomorrow, what would the grid in the state of California do, right? So you can't just wave your magic wand, similar to the automobile regulations that they're putting in place. The California Air Resources Board has put forth something similar for locomotives. And even if we were to find the magic wand that would allow us to switch tomorrow, the grid's not ready, quite frankly. So battery electric is certainly one that we think has a place in targeted spots. So the others that we're looking at, I mentioned hydrogen. Hydrogen is an interesting one because with respect to diesel, in terms of the efficiencies and the volumes that you would need, pretty similar to diesel. The biggest challenge, or maybe the bigger challenge, is how you integrate that into our operations. So today, we've got hundreds of fueling facilities across our network. To go in and replace all of that with hydrogen would be a massive infrastructure investment. Likely, we would have to use liquid hydrogen. So you'd pull that in a cryogenic tank car behind the locomotive. And so are we going to invest in liquefaction all across our country? So something that we have to consider. But all that said, we have plans to test a hydrogen fuel cell locomotive in the next few years. And then lastly, probably an interesting thing, I would say the next bridge after renewables is if we could introduce a hybrid locomotive. Maybe you put a small battery on board. You effectively extend the range of your diesel locomotive, but if we've got the cleanest fleet in the industry. So if you've got the cleanest burning, what we call Tier 4 locomotives, burning renewable diesel that may be a 70% carbon reduction, augmented by batteries that might get you an additional 10 to 15% fuel. It's a great story to tell. We're already the cleanest form of land transportation. So we see this natural transition that we've got a plan for 2030 and then beyond. We're still considering what our options look like.
Thank you. Jeff, how is federal and state regulation impacting the development of SAF?
Yeah, it's really critical, and as I think was referenced in the first speaker today, there were, in the Inflation Reduction Act, there were a couple different provisions that really tried to spur the development of the SAF economy, a blender's tax credit and a fuel tax credit, which is really a great start and support bipartisan from the federal government. The only issue is that it was only in place until 2027, which, our hope is that we don't need incentives long-term, into perpetuity, but we do need them up front in order to try and get the industry up and running. And 5 or 6 years is not long when you're asking for these large investments to be made in the type of facilities and production facilities that need to be done. So it's a great first start from the federal side. I think, hoping that we can continue to try and extend them past the 27. But as you know, Lieutenant Governor, that states play an important role in this as well. And so we're really excited to see the enthusiasm and the engagement at the state level as well. We saw in 2023 states like Illinois and Washington pass tax credits, and actually, in Minnesota, actually passed a nation-leading SAF tax credit, both a blender's tax credit as well as a sales tax exemption on construction of either a new SAF facility or on a retrofit of a current facility. So, what we've seen just short term in Minnesota since that passed is the development, what's called the Minnesota SAF Hub, come from that. And so a number of different companies, Delta Airlines and Ecolab, Xcel Energy, Bank of America, and others now looking at Minnesota as a place to try and grow that SAF industry. And so it's going to take everybody. It's going to take the entire value chain. We know that. There's roles for all the states to play, North Dakota as well. But it's crucial as we're trying to get this industry up and going.
Thank you. Denver, how are federal regulations and policies impacting fuel in the trucking industry?
A lot. Christopher used an interesting phrase, regulatory tsunami. It's his phrase, not mine, but there's regulations are coming fast and furious. In December, the Environmental Protection Agency implemented stricter emission standards for nitrogen oxide and particulate matter, as well as greenhouse gas emissions for model year 2027. And just to give you an idea of what this would do is that in model year 2027, the NOx emissions would come down approximately 50 to 80%, and the particulate matter about another 50%. In addition to that, EPA currently has a rulemaking procedure open, and you can comment on it if you would like. And it's new greenhouse gas emissions for heavy-duty trucks, and they're going to set emission standards for 2028 through model year 2032. The best estimate that I can see right now is that somewhere between 25 and 30% reduction in CO2 emissions is the target for, like say, a day cab, a Class 8 heavy-duty day cab truck. As we talked about a little bit earlier, the tsunami applies to railroads as well as to trucks, and so on November 17th, the EPA issued a request for information to understand decarbonization strategies for railroads, and so BNSF and Mike are going to be heavily involved in that, and so they're going to come up with a strategy, long-term strategy to decarbonize freight rail. And we don't yet know what the technologies are going to be. They're asking for input on the most promising and economical ones, and they haven't stated a time frame yet. I will just go back to the California situation, though. California is going to be requiring trucks entering ports, drayage trucks and rail yards by 2025 to be zero-emission vehicles. And so that kind of sets the landscape for what they're looking at for railroads as well.
How are folks in North Dakota gearing up for that?
Pardon me, Lieutenant Governor?
How are folks in North Dakota gearing up for this regulation?
Well, at this point, there really isn't that much that we can do. The manufacturers, the engine manufacturers, are going to have to design their engines to meet those emission standards. And so what will it mean for commercial trucking? It'll mean more expensive new equipment that's going to be coming online. It's going to increase the cost of trucking, but that's going to be the same across the United States. So we would not be necessarily disadvantaged by these regulations. I would also say that there are some presidential goals and proclamations in addition to the EP regulations, and one of them is like 50% of the new vehicles that will be purchased by the federal government would be electric by 2020. A lot of states like California are also going that way. I don't think that we're going to be going in that direction, but...
Thank you. Maybe piggybacking on that, Mike, why don't you talk a little bit about how the rail infrastructure will have to change to support more diverse fuel
Sure.
options?
Yeah, a couple things, and I'll just piggyback on the last thing Denver said there. You know, we operate that massive fleet of locomotives, but what a lot of folks don't know is we've also got a fleet of 8,000 vehicles that we operate across our territory. Everything from Class 8 trucks and these what we call terminal tractors that operate in our intermodal facilities, down to you know, the pickup truck or the Ford Explorer that a terminal manager drives around. So we have to look at those as well, certainly as the state of California is very aggressive in what they're expecting. So we've got a plan for our terminal tractors. We've already converted close to 50 in the state of California. But what that does mean is that you've got to put the electrical infrastructure in place. So just maybe one other comment to the earlier question, working on a couple different projects in California, and it is a dogfight to try to get power out there, because if it's not available, you're potentially waiting 5 to 10 years. Chris was spot on when he talked about permitting, and California is the epicenter of all that, where you better get in line now if you want something a decade from now. So that's a challenge that we see not only on the tractor side, but certainly for the locomotives as well. When we think about infrastructure, I think this is where that monkey bars analogy is so apt, because we're not going to go pour a lot of money into solutions until we know what the right step is, right? Is it hydrogen? Is it battery electric? And for example, if it is battery electric, well, we got to know that the grid is going to be there. And if the desire, the push is to have clean, renewable energy, okay, well, it can't be solar until we've got enough storage in the form of batteries or maybe even hydrogen to support it. We're a 24/7 operation. We're an outdoor sport, so we need that power available at all times. I think the last comment I would highlight with respect to infrastructure, we compete with the Union Pacific, who is our other Western railroad, and the Eastern railroads, but we also collaborate with them. And it's not uncommon to see our locomotives operating on another network, right? So all that to say, we need an interoperable solution. And the BNSF can't select battery electric if the Canadian Pacific is choosing hydrogen and the UP decides to go electrify with catenary, because I can't hand my locomotive off if you can't charge it or fuel it. So the infrastructure decision is one we're looking at internally, but we're having to collaborate across the industry to ultimately figure out where this industry goes 20, 30 years from now.
Thank you. Jeff, I know you have a goal to have 10% utilization of SAF. Tell us about your progress toward that goal.
Yeah, so to put that in context, so we have said by 2030, Delta Airlines wants 10% of our jet fuel to be replaced by sustainable aviation fuel. We use 4 billion gallons a year of jet fuel. 10% of that is 400 million. As I said up front, there's 15 million gallons of SAF that were produced in the US in 2022. So just for Delta, we have to increase that. But if you look at what the airline industry as a whole is working towards, it's about 3 billion gallons by 2030. So we have to get from 15 million gallons in 2022 to 3 billion for the industry. And then Delta has made the commitment that by 2035, we want to be at 35%, and then we want it to continue to grow. And our hope, as I said before, right now it's a 50-50 blend rate, 50% SAF, 50% jet. We're working with the aircraft manufacturer, the engine manufacturers, to continue to try and get that blend rate to be higher. So we want to continue to grow our usage of SAF. So 400 million by 2030. We have announced offtake agreements in place for about 200 million of that by 2030, so we're halfway there. Obviously, we need to continue to have the industry develop and to be able to get the second half. There was a big event yesterday. Virgin Atlantic, which is a partner of Delta Airlines, flew the very first transatlantic flight with 100% SAF. They're on the plane, so both engines operating from SAF. We're not customers on board. It was an experimental flight, but it flew from London to JFK. The fact that occurred is just a huge deal for the industry to show that we need more of it, but we know it works. We know it's safe to use, and so now we need to continue to work to try and increase how much is being produced.
Thank you, Jeff. Back to you, Denver. We are hearing a lot about electric vehicles. There's some adoption on a personal level. What's happening with EVs on the commercial level?
Well, there's widespread adoption, certainly in California and some other states, but there are some obstacles and challenges, and so I'll just name 4. The initial cost of the vehicle, the availability of the charging infrastructure, the charging time, and the range of the operation. So the initial cost of a battery electric vehicle or a fuel cell electric vehicle can be 2 to 3 times greater than conventional truck costs, and depending on what the market is, it might vary. But we really need the charging and hydrogen fueling infrastructure in place. So Mike was talking about that. It's a coin with two sides, and on one side, the truckers are looking at it and saying, there's no certainty. We have to have a charging infrastructure in place. On the other side of the coin, an entrepreneur, like a big truck stop, for example, is looking at it and saying, well, I don't know what the demand is going to be if I put in this big charging infrastructure. So what am I going to do? So there has to be a lot more certainty, and there's absolutely going to have to be some federal investment in the charging infrastructure before battery electric trucks actually take off. And the limited range of the operation was mentioned a little bit earlier, with battery technology developing and growing. That range of operation is also going to increase over time. Right now, most of the trucks are saying 200 to 500 mile range. Tesla has claimed 500 miles for its semi that's been used by PepsiCo. So over time, we will evolve and solve some of these issues. I would also say that within the trucking community itself, I think they have the same philosophy as BNSF. It's one option doesn't fit every situation. As many options are possible as needed. So the industry's kind of sitting back right now, and they're saying, yeah, hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles, we see need for them. We have to have the charging infrastructure. Battery electric vehicles are already rolling out, and they're already widespread. Renewable diesel, the industry would really love to have renewable diesel as a bridge to this zero emission vehicle future that we're talking about. Actually, there have been some tremendous improvements in internal combustion engines that I'll talk about a little bit later on.
Thank you. Mike, how is the role of transportation, rail transportation, changing as the energy sources are changing?
I love this question because, I mentioned earlier that rail is the cleanest form of land transportation. Denver and I were just talking off stage here, and I think the average today is now across all commodities that we can move a ton of freight 500 miles on a gallon of diesel. When you look at U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, transportation represents about 33%. So a third of greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. come from transportation. Of that 33%, rail represents 2%. Passengers about 50, and medium and heavy duty trucking is about 1/4 of the 33%. So my answer is, if we're really serious at a national level about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, let's move more traffic to rail. I think overall we win, we bring down emissions, even if that means rail emissions increase. Now, you don't say that too loudly because it's a soundbite. You've got to explain the details. But to say that if we are the most efficient form of land transportation, let's move more freight to rail. We'll continue to do our part to drive emissions down. And again, thinking about it in the context of the national change that we need to take place. It can't just be BNSF. It's got to be the Union Pacific, the other 5 additional Class I railroads. But it is a compelling opportunity for rail. When you think about some of the technologies that us and the other railroads are looking at, there's a real winning formula, I think, when we look at rail, when we look at the different opportunities. And I think, again, I'll just kind of underscore this whole notion of moving at the pace of innovation. It's going to take time, and we need to recognize that. But I sure am bullish on the future.
Thank you. Jeff, what more should we be doing in the Midwest to support SAF development, and more specifically, North Dakota?
Well, it's really why I was so excited to get the opportunity to be here today, because as we think about SAF, we think about the Midwest should be leading in this endeavor. So as we look at the map and we have 9 hubs in the U.S. and a few more around the world. As we look at the map and we think about SAF, the Midwest to us keeps jumping off the page. And the reason why that's the case is it really has, what we sort of call the triple crown, right? That it has the feedstock that you need to make SAF: corn, soy, soybean, hydrogen, woody waste, and so on and so forth. And what's so great about where we are right now with SAF is there's not one right answer. We are feedstock neutral, we are technology neutral, but the Midwest has an abundance of a number of different ways that you can make SAF. So the feedstock is in the Midwest. There is a strong history of producing biofuel, whether it's ethanol or biodiesel or other products. That the Midwest knows how to do it, has done it extremely well. And we view SAF as that next product that the Midwest can get excited about, especially as maybe other vehicles are starting to shift more away or to electric. Electric planes that anyone in this room or online would want to fly in are 60 years away from a commercial standpoint. And so for us, SAF is just coming online. We're really excited about that. And then you've got large airports sitting in the Midwest, including our second largest hub in Minneapolis, that is thirsty for the product. And so we know as Delta that our job in all this is to make sure people understand the demand. And I've talked about that today. If you get all the way to 2050 and you're talking about transitioning fuel, that's 35 billion gallons of SAF that's going to be needed in the next, over the next 3 decades. And so we know the demand is there and that the opportunity is there throughout the value chain, whether it's the farmer, whether it's the producer, whether it's the transportation, logistics, up and down the value chain, the energy companies. There is a great opportunity to help try and solve this problem, do it together, and there is no question in our minds that the Midwest and North Dakota can and should lead in this, and we're just excited to be part of that conversation.
Thank you. And Denver, I think this is our last question. Tell us about some of the new technology in the commercial transportation industry that is helping us to increase fuel efficiency.
There's been a tremendous increase in the fuel efficiency of internal combustion engines over time. I think Volvo was saying their energy efficiency has increased by 50% and their emissions have gone down 90% just since 2009. We have spent a decade of research and development into something called the SuperTruck 2, and I'm not sure if you've ever heard of it. Thanks to the Department of Energy for funding a lot of this research. There are several versions of that coming on the market now, and Volvo claims that its Super 2 truck will increase its fuel efficiency by 100% over 2009 fuel consumption rates, and it may achieve a fuel efficiency of 16 miles per gallon. So you may ask, how is this going to happen? Well, it's going to have lighter tires of different material. The overall truck itself is going to be lighter for a given payload capacity. The truck itself is going to have fewer axles, which is going to reduce rolling resistance, but they can't overload the axles. The truck itself is going to be very streamlined and supposedly will reduce aerodynamic drag by 50%. Automation of commercial trucking is underway in the Southwest and is spreading around. The truck itself is going to be completely controlled by computer software, all the throttle settings, all the movements, consistent speed. We know that's going to add to fuel efficiency. We don't really know how much yet. Platooning has been around for some time and will continue to grow in certain areas. And depending on the operation, 4 to 10% fuel efficiency savings resulting from that. So there are lots of technologies that really can help the internal combustion engine be a lot more efficient, and we can reduce emissions. But I also wanted to kind of go back to the rollout of electric vehicles. Right now, there's some low-hanging fruit, ports and terminals where the range of movement is 50, 60 miles a day, and you don't have to worry about a charging infrastructure. Those will go electric right away, probably will. The first and last mile movements, some of you may have seen that Amazon is a goal to acquire 100,000 electric vehicles in its fleet by 2030. I just obviously don't see how they can do that, but it's a goal nonetheless. And of course, then all of our intra-city movements by truck are going to be electric vehicles as we go forward. So although I'm talking about hydrogen and other options, electric vehicles are here, the rollout is here, and we're going to see those areas transition over very quickly.
Thank you. Sadly, we are just about out of time. Why don't we just go down the line and share any closing comments, anything you didn't have an opportunity to share, or anything you'd like to punctuate? Jeff, why don't we start with you?
Well, I just want to thank again everyone for coming together for this discussion. You know, as I said before, we know in our case of SAF, Delta Airlines cannot solve this alone. It's going to take all the people that are in this room from all the different industries and sectors that they work in to try and solve this. But we're really excited about what the future holds in SAF, and really excited about the role that the Midwest can play in that.
Thank you. Mike.
Yeah, thanks as well to the host, Lieutenant Governor Miller, and everybody in the room and online. I think two things. One would be, you know, BNSF is committed to our sustainability journey. We're committed to our 30/30 goal, and certainly innovation is an exciting space to be in. The other thing, I'd be remiss if I didn't remind the folks in the room, we are a transportation company. Again, we are the cleanest form of land transportation. So to the extent we can partner with folks in the room, and certainly anybody who is looking to reduce their overall emissions. I think rail is often an unsung hero that people kind of forget about. You know, we're the backbone of our nation's economy, and people don't think about it. So just a reminder of the incredible story about rail in this country, and the role we can play in the future. So thank you.
Mike. Denver.
Well, thank you. It's been great to be here. It's a very exciting future. It's a high-tech future. We have lots of fuel choices and selections, and we're going to be making progress towards our environmental goals. I hope we follow a logical transition like Chris and Mike talked about. I'm not sure about that, but you can make that known that is your choice and your preference. So thank you.
Thank you. And to our audience, I hope you will all help us work on these challenges with innovation and not regulation, and help be part of the solution. With that, I want to thank our panelists for sharing their expertise and their strategies. Let's give our panelists a round of applause. Thank you, Jeff, Mike, and Denver. And with that, we will be taking a break for 10 minutes. See you back in 10 minutes. Thank you. Thank you. It's great.
Ladies and gentlemen, our program will resume in 5 minutes. Once again, our program will resume in 5 minutes. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, today's program will resume in 1 minute. Please find your seats. Once again, today's program will resume in 1 minute. Please find your seats. Thank you.
Good morning. If you would find your seats, please. We are going to start with the second half. Please start finding your seats. I was giving the team a hard time about the script because there hasn't been any energy puns yet, so what an electrifying morning. Let's keep up the energy in the second half. Yeah, there we go. Really, what a great morning, though. We're excited for this second half. Before we jump right into it, I want to introduce our other premier sponsor for this morning's event, Xcel Energy. Without further ado, please welcome Tony Grinberg, North Dakota Principal Manager of Xcel Energy, to the stage.
Transportation, food supply, everything is going carbon-free. At Xcel Energy, we see it too. Eco-friendly car washes, carbon-free search engines, and all that clean energy needs clean energy. The same reliable, more affordable energy that powers your home. This is how the future is made.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Catherine Grinberg, for that kind introduction. Many of you may not know that Catherine is my daughter-in-law. And one of the things that I instilled in my son early on is when you pick a mate, marry up. My son clearly married up. Catherine is a wonderful addition to our family. It's a privilege for me to be here this morning on behalf of Xcel Energy. You know, I work with a very talented group of leaders here in North Dakota, as well as across our 8-state system. You know, it's interesting when you look at the topics of over the last 3 years, carbon-free has been central stage for the discussion. You know, in our case at Xcel Energy, we declared in the middle of President Trump's administration that we would be carbon-free by 2050. Marshall Albright talked about the time required earlier in his remarks. So we picked 33 years to be carbon-free, and we're well on that journey. Decisions Xcel Energy has made to date will be 85% carbon-free by 2030. And that requires strong discipline, technology, and the ability to deliver affordable and reliable energy as that investment progresses. Lieutenant Governor Miller talked about innovation, not regulation. We certainly embrace that at Xcel Energy. We have made commitments based on that notion of moving the nation forward as one of our premier utilities here in the upper Midwest. Cale Dunwoody called me. Cale needs a shout out because of his diligence, particularly with the chamber and the entire staff of putting the planning together for a summit like this. And Cale called me, I think it was in May, June maybe, and said, hey, any ideas for the 3rd annual summit? And I said, well, let me tell you a story. Greg Chamberlain and I, Greg's Vice President of Clean Fuels for Xcel Energy, made a visit to the EERC at the University of North Dakota in July of 2022. Through the federal legislation, the whole potential of a hydrogen hub was a possibility that we wanted to explore with EERC. A result of that effort, an application was submitted in April of this year, and I said to Cale, if we get lucky and EERC is awarded this, with Xcel being a partner, TC Energy, and Marathon Oil, this might be kind of a big deal. Well, lo and behold, the efforts led by Greg Chamberlain on behalf of Xcel Energy, EERC leadership, Charlie Gurecki, and the entire team, we were successful. And I think that exemplifies our way of getting things done in the Midwest. And I think that's, you know, I really appreciate Cale's diligence to pull this off. So very happy to be here today, and also the privilege of kicking off the second half of this program. So let's do that by having Doug Schultz join us by video. Mr. Schultz is currently the Chief Operating Officer for the Department of Energy's new Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, which is executing on more than $20 billion in pilot and demonstration scale clean energy technologies funded through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill. Prior to joining OCED, he was Director of Loan Guarantee Origination for the U.S. Department of Energy's Loan Program Office, where he was a member of the original startup team and led their lending activities. As an accomplished executive and proven innovator, Mr. Schultz has been active as a consultant, developer, and lender in the energy and infrastructure sectors for more than 25 years and abroad. Please turn your attention to the screens for Mr. Doug Schultz. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you so much for the chance to join you today to talk about the Department of Energy's Regional Clean Hydrogen Hubs. My name is Doug Schultz, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer for the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, or OCED. At OCED, we work to accelerate the market adoption of clean energy technologies and support the critical innovation needed to build a strong American clean energy economy. From carbon management to industrial decarbonization, my colleagues at OCED and I are committed to deploying a variety of clean energy projects that help scale up private sector investment in clean energy while reducing emissions, creating quality jobs, and enabling justice and equity in investment opportunities. Our OCED team is working to deliver the benefits of clean energy to communities across America through a variety of initiatives. The bipartisan infrastructure law provided DOE with an historic $8 billion in funding to develop regional clean hydrogen hubs across America and accelerate the commercial scale deployment of low cost clean hydrogen and further decarbonize the US economy. To decrease the cost of clean hydrogen, we need to rapidly scale infrastructure and technology, which is why DOE recently announced the 7 regional clean hydrogen hubs, which we also refer to as H2 hubs. An important part of ensuring the success of H2 hubs is also focusing on market demand. Of the $8 billion provided by the bipartisan infrastructure law, we also allocated up to $1 billion for a demand-side initiative to ensure that both producers and end users in the H2 hubs have the market certainty they need during the early years of production to unlock critical private investment. This is a new program where DOE will enter into one or multiple agreements with independent, not-for-profit U.S. entities to assist in the de-risking of clean hydrogen through demand certainty or other means, such as contracts for differences. DOE envisions that these measures would accelerate commercialization of clean hydrogen by providing medium-term revenue certainty to projects affiliated with the DOE selected regional clean hydrogen hubs. We need these demand-side support measures to accelerate commercialization and demonstrate the production, processing, delivery, storage, and end use of clean hydrogen by providing predictability in the commercial markets for early deployments. Along these lines, we announced a request for proposal for this program in September and look forward to announcing an entity soon. In October, we also announced up to $7 billion, the remaining $7 billion, for the 7 regional clean hydrogen hubs located throughout the nation, creating the country's first ever network of clean hydrogen infrastructure. The 7 selected hydrogen H2 hubs will catalyze more than $40 billion of private investment and create tens of thousands of good paying jobs, bringing the total public and private investment in hydrogen hubs to nearly $50 billion. This program is just one of many programs that are working to ensure a successful transition to a zero emission economy, which means creating meaningful job opportunities for all Americans. And as you already know, your region is among the 7 selectees. Named the Heartland Hydrogen Hub, your regional hub consists of 3 primary projects located across North Dakota, South Dakota, and Minnesota, with the potential to expand into neighboring states. OCED is proudly supporting the Heartland Hydrogen Hub's plans to leverage regionally abundant energy resources to help decarbonize the agricultural sector's production of fertilizer and decrease the regional cost of clean hydrogen. Clean energy demonstration projects can help breathe additional life into local communities and offer good family-sustaining jobs for workers. The hub also proposes using clean hydrogen for power generation in a manner which may catalyze co-firing hydrogen and utility-owned generation across the country. These initiatives will help reduce roughly 1 million metric tons per year of carbon emissions while extending profit sharing and benefits for the expanding hydrogen economy in wider communities. Following a successful negotiation, DOE plans to award up to $925 million for the Heartland Hydrogen Hub over the lifetime of the project. The Energy and Environmental Research Center is the primary applicant for the hub. We're delighted to share that the Heartland Hydrogen Hub anticipates creating over 3,800 direct jobs, over 3,000 which are in construction and over 700 in permanent jobs. From engineers to construction workers, targeted investments such as these create jobs while helping reduce costs and energy and make new breakthroughs in technologies that benefit communities. Your hub has committed tens of millions of dollars to create an education consortium to oversee career development, workforce training, apprenticeship programs, which includes several tribal colleges and universities. How monumental is it is to be creating the next generation of clean energy workers right here, right now. Additionally, a goal of the Heartland Hydrogen Hub is to contract hundreds of millions of dollars for businesses owned by women, minorities, disabled veterans, disadvantaged communities, or LGBTQ persons. We are committed to ensuring equitable access to clean energy jobs. OSED values the importance of engaging in a variety of stakeholders in the community for any project we support with transparency. To oversee implementation of the Community Benefits Plan, H2 Hubs intends to create a CPP advisory board. So keep an eye out for opportunities to be involved. I'm pleased to preview the Heartland project with you, and I'm told that you will hear remarks from Charles Gorecki with the University of North Dakota following my remarks. We are just at the beginning of a transformative moment in clean energy that we hope will unleash economic prosperity for all. Everyone has an important part to play in building the clean energy economy, and you can already see the firsthand that with these hubs. As you know, the success of our clean energy transition requires communities, yours and those you represent, to be consulted and engaged often and regularly. It will require transparency and accountability and new approaches to solve old and persistent problems. And we're excited to be partnering with you on all of this to get the job done well. The Department of Energy is committed to assuring these projects create real economic and environmental benefits for the communities and workers where they are located. We have an opportunity to create a blueprint for a clean energy transition that is inclusive, just, and equitable, while launching an entirely new sector. To do this will require the work of those of you here today as partners and advisors for OSED and DOE, shaping the success of this program to make sure it meets the needs of your community. The entire OSED team and the department look forward to walking this path in partnership with you to create a bright, clean energy future full of economic prosperity, good paying jobs, and a cleaner and safer environment for all of us. Thank you.
Please welcome CEO for the Energy and Environmental Research Center, Charles Gorecki.
Well, thank you, and I'm really pleased to be here. I recognize so many people here, but I know there's a lot of people who maybe don't know the EERC or who I am, so maybe just a little bit on who we are first, why Xcel Energy, TC, Marathon all decided to team with us, and how we were ready to lead the Heartland Hydrogen Hub. So for those of you who aren't aware, the EERC, or Energy and Environmental Research Center, is part of the University of North Dakota. We're a non-teaching branch with about 275 employees, all focused on developing solutions to energy and environmental challenges. Part of what makes us uniquely suited to be able to take on these challenges is that we are part of the university, we are state employees. However, back in the 1950s, the EERC was a federal facility. We're actually part of the U.S. Bureau of Mines. We became part of the U.S. Department of Energy in the 1970s when it was founded. And then we were defederalized in 1983 by then President Ronald Reagan and became part of the University of North Dakota. So because of that background, because of those roots, and because of our mix of work, which I'll talk about in a little bit, we're really ideally suited to be able to take on these challenges. And the EERC itself, our vision is to lead the world in developing solutions to energy and environmental challenges. And this hydrogen hub is another one of those challenges. How do we produce more power with lower environmental impact? I've talked at other places before. We have currently 8 billion people on planet Earth, a quarter of those people currently living in energy poverty, and by 2060, we'll probably have over 10 billion people on planet Earth. So the need and demand for energy is growing. At the same time, we need to be able to do that and produce it as cleanly and efficiently as possible. So at the EERC, I mentioned we have about 275 employees. We basically have every energy and scientific discipline represented, as well as contracting, document production, and all the different aspects necessary to be able to develop those new technologies. And while the EERC doesn't produce widgets, our greatest asset is our people. So we really have invested in our people and underpinned that with 5 core values: to be safe, ethical, engaged, effective, and professional. And by doing that, by investing in our people, by giving them the environment to be successful in developing technologies, we've really grown and to be able to cover all the different types of energy and reduce the environmental impact of those. If you haven't been to the EERC, I'd like to extend a welcome to reach out to me in the future to have a tour of our facility. I have here on screen shown our facility. We're about 250,000 square feet of office, demonstration, and laboratory space. And I do want to point out a couple of things on this map. You'll see in the upper right-hand corner the National Center for Hydrogen Technology. So hydrogen for us is not a new technology, not something that we just started working on yesterday. In fact, really all the way back to the 1950s, we were working on hydrogen technology, mostly by gasification of coal, which we currently do in North Dakota at the Dakota Gasification Facility. And then in the early 2000s is when we had this designation. We worked on hydrogen quite a bit. But as you can see, we're able to come up with those ideas in our offices, take them into the laboratory, try them in our demonstration facility, and what's more important is we're able to take them out into the field with partners like Xcel, who's with you today, with TC and Marathon Petroleum, and get those technologies into the field and commercialize them for the betterment of the people of North Dakota and beyond. Because of the way that we're situated as a nonprofit, part of the university, part of the state, we're ideally suited to be able to work with taking state and federal funding and leverage that with industry dollars for the betterment and to the advancement of these energy technologies. And today, this is about how the EERC is funded, about a third, with state, industry, and federal government being those funding partners. And I will also say that it's not in the form of direct appropriations. It's in the form of contracts, cooperative agreements. The EERC has also been designated the State Energy Research Center by the legislature, and there is an appropriation for that. However, it is still contracted through the North Dakota Industrial Commission. So while we're part of the University of North Dakota, part of the state of North Dakota, we've all worked in all 50 states and 53 countries around the world. So we can do things in North Dakota, lead the way here, and then transfer those technologies around the world and apply them in different locations. Because I think what's really important to understand, and we can see that just from looking at North Dakota and Minnesota as an example, we have different resource mix, we have different ability for things like carbon capture and storage, or renewable energy penetration, and so there's a lot of opportunity to do different solutions for different regions. Our core research priority areas are carbon management, oil and gas, hydrogen, alternative fuels, renewable energy, coal utilization and emission reduction, the water energy nexus, and rare earth elements and critical minerals. These are some of our key priority areas, and one of those I've mentioned here is hydrogen, which will be the focus of the rest of my talk. You got to hear from Mr. Schultz a little bit earlier, but why hydrogen? Why are we talking about it? And Chris did a great job talking about it earlier as well. But hydrogen is the most abundant molecule in our universe. It's ubiquitous. You'll notice that it's listed here in the form of water, H2O. But most of that hydrogen is currently locked up in some other chemical formula, like water, or like long-chain hydrocarbons, or natural gas. So what we can do, though, is take and make hydrogen out of several different processes, including electrolysis, utilizing renewable or nuclear power. By splitting those water molecules, we can take methane or natural gas, we can reform it, and then capture the carbon dioxide when we split the carbon away from the hydrogen, and then store that carbon dioxide permanently in the ground. We can also make it biologically. So currently, the United States produces about 10 million metric tons of hydrogen each year. So there is existing pipelines, there is existing production of hydrogen that happens today, although most of it is localized in the Gulf region, and it's mostly used today for industrial uses and refining purposes. So why hydrogen? We heard Chris talk about it earlier. I think he did a fantastic job. He stole my line. Actually, it's not my line, but it's the Swiss Army knife of energy. It's really good at doing a lot of things, but it's not necessarily the best thing to do any individual task, right? You can use it to put in a Swiss Army knife to screw in a screw, but it might be easier to use a power drill at times. The benefit of hydrogen, though, is that it has no carbon emissions when you use it in a fuel cell or you combust it directly. So for that reason, hydrogen is an ideally suited thing. And as I mentioned before, we can produce it by a number of different ways. Everything from electrolysis with renewables and nuclear power to taking methane or coal or oil and gas and then taking the hydrogen off and then capturing the carbon dioxide. And we can see in this schematic, we can then store it in vessels, potentially underground. The EERC has also been tasked by the legislature with developing salt caverns in the subsurface in western North Dakota to do that storage for hydrogen or other liquid fuels. We can utilize that blended today in our natural gas pipelines, potentially up to a certain percentage. Today we can transport it in those existing pipelines and also can combust it in our existing gas turbines up to, again, a certain percentage. I believe something around the 10% range. We can also utilize it to make synthetic fuels. We heard about the need and demand for things like synthetic or sustainable aviation fuels. So another opportunity for us as well. And one of the biggest things that we can do with it today, the biggest demand area is for fertilizers, and low carbon fertilizers has an immediate demand for us in the state of North Dakota. We currently produce in North Dakota, in this region, only a small fraction of what we consume. So there's a lot of demand just here in this region for that. I will also say, and I have to give a lot of thanks to the North Dakota legislature. They had a lot of vision, and a lot of vision before the federal government put out their call for this. Actually, in the 2020 North Dakota legislative session, Representative Mitskog was the one leading the charge, but quickly gained support from the other legislators on a bill to have the EERC develop a hydrogen energy roadmap for the state of North Dakota. That eventually got rolled into the Industrial Commission bill, Bill 2014, and the EERC produced a report, which is with the Industrial Commission today. It is still pending finalization on the basis for how we would produce, utilize, transport hydrogen in North Dakota. This really set the stage for the EERC to be ready when the bipartisan infrastructure law passed to be able to take on this daunting task of leading one of these hydrogen hubs. As already pointed out by Tony, we had a great meeting with Xcel in July of 2022, I think, and we've been talking with TC and Marathon Energy as well about how do we produce, transport, and store hydrogen. And fortunately for us, we put in a concept paper, I believe it was last November. We were one of 79 groups to put in that concept paper. 33 were encouraged. We went on and submitted a full application. From the best of our knowledge, most of those 33 submitted a full application. And we were one of about a dozen that were invited for an interview in Washington, D.C. Around August of this year. And ultimately, we found out we were selected for award negotiation for one of those 7 hubs. You got to hear from Mr. Schultz already. The Department of Energy has this vision of not just creating these isolated hubs inside of the United States to develop, produce, and transport hydrogen, but they want to have a connected, interconnected group of hubs. The EERC, we've also had the fortune of being able to manage the CO2 partnership for the Department of Energy in the past. So we've led now for over 20 years one of the regional carbon sequestration partnership programs. So that also was an ideal thing for us to be able to lead one of these hydrogen hubs. And what I'll say about that 20 years of experience in the regional carbon sequestration partnerships is that we didn't just sit there by ourselves alone working on our things. We integrated and networked with the rest of those hubs, and that's the plan here as well. To link up, share lessons learned, share safety concerns, share educational programming so that we can develop the hydrogen economy in the United States. As you can see, we're one of 7 selected, as Mr. Schultz said, for the $7 billion in funding, up to $925 million from the Department of Energy. And we include a 5-state region that it's inside of our hub. You'll see the production taking place primarily in North Dakota, Minnesota, and South Dakota, but it really extends beyond that. This is where the production will take place, but the impacts, the end use, the community benefits, the workforce training will take place beyond that region into Montana and Wisconsin as well. We believed from the beginning that we had a fantastic proposal. And we believe that because of the resources, because of the partnership we formed, because the companies that we selected to work with were ones that have a long-standing commitment to these communities. These aren't new companies that are coming in trying to develop a new technology. These are the ones you know These are the people in your backyard that you've had a long-standing relationship. We also know that we have a great energy region. So we have this incredible opportunity with all these energy resources from wind, solar, nuclear, oil and gas, coal, that we are perfectly suited to lead the way in this case. And from those fossil fuel resources, North Dakota leads the entire world really with respect to carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So being able to utilize those fossil fuels to make hydrogen and capture the carbon dioxide and permanently store it. So our mission is to produce clean hydrogen using that diverse technology, bridging east and west markets. That's what we do today. Pipeline infrastructure, transmission infrastructure, already doing that. With multiple end users and existing regional markets, and provide shared prosperity with local communities and other stakeholders. Part of the reason I'm here today is to talk about how this can benefit you and how you can get involved with it as well. Structurally, as mentioned already, the EERC was the prime applicant. Ultimately, we're in contract negotiations, and I'll talk about the timeline in a second. But the Heartland Hydrogen Hub will be the lead with subrecipients of the EERC through the EERC Foundation, with the Prairie Horizons Energy Solutions LLC, which is comprised of TC Energy and Marathon Petroleum, and subrecipient Xcel Energy, all being the recipients of the funding and committing large amounts, multiples of the DOE commitment in cost share themselves. So where are we today? I talked about how we got to this application process, where we are in this process today. We're in contract negotiations. We've been selected for award negotiations. We don't have the contract in place at this time. We are hopeful that by mid-2024, we have the contract in place. And then once that happens, we have a 4-stage project that we need to execute. You can see the timeline laid out. Phase 1, a 12 to 18-month period where we develop a detailed plan of exactly how we're going to produce hydrogen, how it will be transported and stored, and then potential end uses. Going into phase 2, which is 2 to 3 years of project development. Phase 3, install, integrate, and construct, again, 2 to 4 years. These are variables. And then phase 4 is to operate the production of this clean hydrogen hub. You can also see that the Prairie Horizons Hub and the Xcel's clean energy and wind ammonia nodes are on a different timeline slightly. And part of that is because of North Dakota's initiative, leadership with respect to developing that plan, the Clean Sustainable Energy Authority, also working with the EERC and the Prairie Horizons Hydrogen Hub to actually accelerate the potential for North Dakota producing this hydrogen actually in front of most other potentials in this, in the whole hub program. When we look at it from a cartoon map, I'll start up at the upper left-hand corner, the Prairie Horizons Energy Solutions, looking at producing hydrogen in the Dickinson region. They currently have a biorefinery there producing renewable diesel fuel. They currently have some hydrogen production there, but looking to expand that with methane reforming and carbon capture and storage, as well as utilizing electrolysis that's taking renewable energy and then splitting those water molecules. So a combination of the two to produce, again, hydrogen. Some of that hydrogen will be utilized in the refining process, others potentially to make fertilizer, low carbon fertilizer. Ultimately, maybe urea, so combining CO2 from a biogenic source like an ethanol facility to produce solid fertilizers with low carbon intensity. If we look at the other nodes, the wind to ammonia node would produce hydrogen with electrolysis from constrained wind, where it's currently having a hard time getting into the market at some points. Again, to make ammonia, to make urea for fertilizer in Minnesota. And then the clean energy node would take a combination of nuclear from Monticello Nuclear Plant, as well as wind and solar to be able to make hydrogen strictly from electrolysis. So there's a wide mix you can see here of production of hydrogen. Of a great importance, and it was talked about by Mr. Schultz, is how do we integrate with the community and how do we have a community benefits plan so it's not just production of more fuels, more things. So we have a very concerted effort on the community benefits aspects. And we want to engage with existing communities like we already are. Native American communities such as Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara Nation, with labor and labor unions, as well as other stakeholders. You already heard about the fact that we want to have an education consortium as well to develop workforce, and this is not just at a four-year college like UND, although part of it could be there. This will be at tribal colleges, community colleges, and four-year universities throughout the entire region to develop workforce for clean energy jobs. As well as advancing diversity, equity, inclusion. All of the companies involved in this have a strong diversity, equity, inclusion policies and practices in place, but we know it can always be better. And we're looking at, through this program, investing hundreds of millions of dollars in contracting with those women-owned, veteran-owned, minority-owned, disadvantaged communities to ensure that this isn't just to a select few, but spreading that out amongst these different communities. And then the Justice 40, where 40% of the benefit goes to disadvantaged communities, and not dollars per se. This is benefits. So how does this hydrogen hub benefit the region? When we look at it specifically, we're going to be accomplishing this through a Community Benefits Plan Management Committee that'll have representation from the EERC as well as TC, Marathon, and Xcel. We'll have a community advisory group, which will have leaders and stakeholders from all 5 states that'll help advise us on how we're going to conduct our community benefits plan, how we're going to execute it. This is not defined yet. We have a plan on how we're going to do it and how we're going to solicit stakeholder engagement on it. And then we're also going to have application process to be part of community benefits teams. So you'll see on the individual project side, we have community advisory panels representing the Prairie Horizons node, the wind to ammonia node, and clean energy hydrogen node as well. We also have enlisted Ramboll, who is an environmental consultant that's helping us with how do we track and measure the benefits to these different communities. So this is really part of one of those EERC goals. Not only are we going to help deploy and develop hydrogen in this region, linked together with other hydrogen networks around the country, but we need to educate the world about this. I need to educate people like you today. And you need to go out and tell your family, your friends on the importance of energy, the importance of infrastructure to get that energy from point A to point B. Can't be undersold enough. And we need to get out there and supply that. And the EERC, through this program and others, will supply things like fact sheets, documentaries, video shorts, and things like you've seen in the past here and listed on this screen for other topics. So that'll be a big portion of what we do. Again, I'm really excited to be here. I know that there's some questions that are popping up. The EERC goal, as I mentioned before, is to develop those ideas. It's to test them in the lab, test them in the pilot plant, work with industry, and then get them deployed out in the field. So with that, thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take any questions. And I'm actually just looking at the screen now, so from the perspective of carbon storage, would the salt caverns be the carbon storage? No. So salt caverns would be produced by dissolution of the salt itself. We have great extensive salt beds deep in the subsurface, somewhere around 8,000 feet in depth. The idea here is we would dissolve the cavern out. This is a technology that's been tested and developed in the Gulf Coast and in Canada. And this would be for storage of things like hydrogen. This would be for storage of things like ethane, propane, and the ability to do that would be for those fluids. Carbon dioxide storage would take place in deep geologic formations like we've currently permitted in the Broom Creek and the Deadwood Formation. So I think I'm out of time. With that, I'd like to thank you for your attendance, and I'd be happy to take any questions during the next break.
Now introducing Senior Vice President for the U.S. Chamber Global Energy Institute, Christopher Guth.
All right. Excited to be back up here for this very important topic. It's been touched on in almost every single one of the previous sessions. But we're here to talk about carbon capture, utilization, and storage, or CCUS. So I'd like to welcome my panelists to the stage. First, we have Wade Basance, the Executive Vice President at Summit Carbon Solutions, Andrew Sorbo, the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives at Minn Kota Power, and John Hamling, the Assistant Vice President for Strategic Partnerships at the Energy and Environmental Research Center. So why don't we just start off with each of you kind of introducing yourself and explaining what the role of your organizations are.
Sure. Well, thank you, Chris. My name is Wade Basance. I'm Executive Vice President with Summit Carbon Solutions. Summit Carbon Solutions is developing a large carbon capture and storage project that proposes to capture CO2 primarily from ethanol plants across a 5-state footprint, North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, Nebraska, Minnesota, aggregate that CO2 into a pipeline system, all new construction, and deliver it to Western North Dakota for permanent injection and storage. And so my role in that is I lead the sequestration or the storage component of that in North Dakota, along with other activities related to the project development in North Dakota.
Thank you. Yes, Andrew Sorbo. I'm the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives for Minn Kota Power. Minn Kota Power is a generation and transmission cooperative headquartered out of Grand Forks, existing solely to serve the benefits and needs of our 11-member owners, one of which is one of the key sponsors here, Cass County Electric. So thank you, Marshall and Cass County. And the reason I think I'm up here on the panel today is Minn Kota is also working on, and has been for a number of years, on a project called Project Tundra, which is an initiative to install the world's largest post-combustion carbon capture facility located off the back of the Milton R. Young Station, which is our dual-unit lignite-fired power plant located near Center, North Dakota.
All right, and I'm John Hamling. I'm with the Energy Environmental Research Center. As Charlie mentioned, our organization is focused on broadly providing solutions for the energy industry and helping to enable practical, prudent, cost-effective, and environmentally sound energy production. As part of that role, EERC has led what's called the Plains CO2 Reduction Partnership, which is broadly focused on enabling CCS development throughout a 10-state, 4-Canadian province region of the US and Canada. We've led that partnership for more than 20 years and have really been focused on developing products and doing work that can help understand, enable, and apply carbon capture and storage across a multitude of industries. Parallel with that, we're also working with project developers like Minn Kota on Project Tundra to help provide technical resource to help look at capture technology, as well as to screen, develop, design, permit, and monitor geologic storage of CO2. And then through that work, combined with the Peace Corps partnership, we're able to bring back learnings, opportunities to go out and do additional research to help with better implementation of projects in the future.
Thanks for that. Before we get into the sort of state and regional questions, let's start at the federal level. Certainly one of the biggest advents in CCUS, perhaps ever, was the significant expansion of the carbon capture tax credit in the Inflation Reduction Act. So from your respective vantage points, how does that tax credit impact the creation of stable and functional carbon markets that aren't yet mature yet?
Sure, I'll start. From my perspective, having spent, more than a decade now trying to, advance commercial CCS projects, including, Project Tundra here that Minn Kota is leading now, one of the biggest challenges was ultimately being able to finance those projects, have the economic support for the project. And so obviously with, the $85 tax credit now, it's very material to providing the economic support for CCS projects, and we see, that's reflected in the number of projects that are proposed around the country today, number of storage facility permits that are, in the queue at EPA, and so those are kind of primary metrics, if you will, indicating what that does for the industry overall. But I think in terms of stabilizing the markets, those projects need to get built. Back to your comments earlier in the intro, Chris, and relative to, do these projects actually get through the NEPA and DOE and et cetera processes to ultimately get built and start bringing large volumes of low carbon fuels and carbon attributes to the marketplace and to ultimately stabilize them? That's the question.
Yep. Andrew?
Yeah, I think from Encoda's perspective, and to piggyback a little bit on Wade, the projects really need to get built. Generally, from a cooperative, from a G&T perspective, when we invest in infrastructure, those costs are picked up by our membership, our ratepayers. Project Tundra, a different project in that it's so capital intensive that that's not something that Encoda could do alone. So the project really needs to be able to stand on its own and be investment grade to drive capital injection from other investors into that project, and that really required the uplift in the 45Q tax credit. It was previously at $50 a ton. We've been working on the project for 8 years, so we were running economics at $50 a ton. It was close. That $35 incremental uplift to 85 really required, especially considering supply chain and inflationary issues that everybody is dealing with today, really required to bring that project to a point where it could be investment grade and drive the capital injection. And until you get those projects built, there won't be a stable carbon market. And if there is, there's not going to be the credits to withstand it.
John?
Yeah, maybe what I would add to that, through our experience with the Peace Corps Partnership and our more than 250 member organizations, which range from coal-fired power generation facilities, oil and gas producers, ethanol producers, biofuel, renewable energy, tax equity investors, banks, state and federal regulatory agencies, and research universities, we get to see a pretty broad perspective. I think in most cases what we're seeing with the IRA and the IRS 45Q tax credits and the recent lift is providing a base business case for CCS projects to move forward. These projects generally require quite a bit of capital investment and some time and upfront cost to develop the projects before you have a revenue stream coming back in for the capture and storage of carbon dioxide. But beyond that, each of these projects, or most of these project developers, are also looking at other incentive programs, whether they be producing a fuel that's being sold into a low carbon fuel market where they can get incremental value for those fuels that are produced that have a lower carbon intensity, or other voluntary markets that can be stacked on top of the IRS 45Q tax credit to make the projects more viable long term, but beyond the current sunset of the tax credit program.
So sticking with 45Q, as you've all mentioned, its expansion has driven significant capital formation. But even bigger than the carbon capture credit within 45Q is the direct air capture credit. So in this region, considering the geology and considering where dollars flow, how do you see investors comparing the two? And do you see as much of a role for direct air capture up here as you do carbon capture?
I can certainly start. So we kind of look at two different terms: carbon capture, utilization, and storage, which is traditionally focused on capturing CO2 from large, high concentration point sources, capturing CO2 at the point of emission, and storing it underground in geologic formations. Direct air capture, carbon dioxide removal, is focused on industrial processes or biologic process that are actually taking CO2 from the atmosphere at very, very low concentrations and either using it or storing it. What we're starting to see, and direct air capture is a newer or a more emerging technology compared to carbon capture and storage, and so they're a little bit earlier on the development chain and looking at Gen 1, Gen 2 technology, which tends to be a little bit more expensive to implement. But I think what we're hearing from those direct air capture providers is that over time, once they get to Gen 2, Gen 3, scaling of manufacturing to get from customized units to mass manufacturing and looking at opportunities to integrate with other industrial processes, there's a lot of opportunity to bring some of that cost of direct air capture down and provide solutions for those for those emissions that are non-point source, that are distributed or low concentration or hard to abate, like tailpipe emissions from vehicles or CO2 produced from home heating systems and other sources like that. And so what we're seeing is some emerging opportunities between industrial carbon capture and storage projects and potential direct air capture projects, where a direct air capture technology developer or program developer might look at, can we use some of the industrial siting of other industrial facilities? Can we take advantage of any excess heat? Can we be a purchaser of low carbon power that's being produced and the CO2 is already being captured? Can we take advantage of those geologic storage sites that are already being developed and contract out the management and storage of that CO2 to make these projects more viable and look at synergies between these two, while at the same time providing additional revenue sources for those industrial sources that are already developing and storing CO2 to help with their business case, and to continue to provide revenue sources for those pore space owners that have option to participate in these projects by providing additional storage opportunities and additional long-term payments for that storage of carbon dioxide.
It's definitely a nascent technology, but in other parts of the country, we're seeing significant investment. We'll see what happens. So bringing it a little more regional, CCUS is carbon capture, utilization, and storage, meaning that you not only need to capture the CO2, but then move it to a place where it can be geologically sequestered. But yet, we're seeing certain industries arguing against their, what I would suggest, their own benefit in trying to prevent CO2 pipelines from being sited throughout the Midwest, coming up here for permanent sequestration. I think everyone, us included, have talked about the inability to permit things. You know, in this part of the country, how do we solve for that? How do we get, in this particular case, how do we get the agricultural industry supportive of a pipeline that would take captured CO2 from an ethanol facility that they need in order to market their product? I'm not going to pretend that I'm a Midwesterner or understand it, but it seems it's very confusing to an outsider on how an industry like that would argue against self-interest. So without necessarily addressing that particular situation, you know, how do we get people comfortable with building pipelines and with CO2, something that is inert and is not going to cause the kind of potential damage that other products going through pipelines are? Any suggestions? I'm ready to take notes.
Wade, that seems like a question directed right at you.
Doesn't it? Well, thank you. I'll jump on that one then. You know, so I think ultimately at the end of the day, it comes down to two things. One is call it collaboration amongst industry, business leaders, community leaders, and two, it's education. I would say that out of the box, most people in the Dakotas that were opposing pipelines didn't understand what you just said, right? Because at the end of the day, energy and agriculture represent 70% of North Dakota's economy. And the markets are demanding, if you will, lower carbon energy. And likely in the future, not too distant future, lower carbon food. That is our livelihoods, all of our livelihoods. And so without that, call it, basis of understanding of why are we doing this anyway? And then a understanding of how do we do it safely? How do we address your concerns? As I travel around and have met with hundreds and hundreds of landowners, I typically, in the early stages, would hear three things: concerns about liability, concerns about safety, and concerns about compensation. When am I going to get paid? Okay? Today, landowners are no longer concerned primarily about reclamation or liabilities. They're increasingly comfortable with safety, and you're down to just talking about compensation. But it's taken us 18 months to get there. And so I think that is the solution. It's largely collaboration and education.
Yeah, maybe I would just add on to that. So I think a lot of opposition to CCS and pipelines stems from it feeling very new to those individuals. It feels like a new technology or a technology that they're unfamiliar with. But as a country, we've been moving CO2 around for more than 50 years. North Dakota, there's a facility in North Dakota that's been capturing CO2 and moving it through a pipeline to out of state, actually out of country, to Saskatchewan into an oil fields for enhanced oil recovery for more than 20 years. We finally, just 2 years ago, got a new pipeline, CO2 pipeline into North Dakota that's bringing CO2 from out of state, from Wyoming, so that North Dakota can do our first CO2 enhanced oil recovery project. For those of you that don't know, enhanced oil recovery is essentially putting CO2 into a depleted oil and gas reservoir. That CO2 helps mobilize oil that would not have otherwise been mobilized, and you can extend the production and the lifetime of these fields where you've already put in the infrastructure and already drilled the wells. So we have experience there, and we've been handling CO2 in a very safe manner for a long time. We also have a lot of capacity in North Dakota. We have hundreds of billions of tons of CO2 storage capacity in the state. To put that in perspective, we only produce about 30 million tons a year of CO2 from our large point sources. So we have a lot of room for potential storage in the geology in North Dakota that can be a really big enabler for the industries that we already have and attracting new industries to the state. The third thing I would say is I think enhanced oil recovery is really important for those states like North Dakota, where oil production and hydrocarbon production contributes more than 50%, I believe more than 50% of our state's tax revenue. And so if we can take a look and use CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, just to put this in perspective, the Bakken Petroleum System is estimated to contain between 200 billion to close to 1 trillion barrels of oil in place. To put that in perspective, the U.S. has produced 244 billion barrels of oil since 1859 on U.S.-9 oil fields. So there's more oil in the Bakken Formation than the U.S. has produced. If we're able to unlock EOR in the Bakken, we could end up and we could extend the life of Bakken production by decades. We could potentially double the production out of that resource for the state. But to do so, we're going to need somewhere between, initial estimates estimate between 1 and 3 and maybe 5 billion tons of CO2 that could mobilize somewhere between 3, 7, 10 billion extra barrels of oil production. And so the challenge is we don't have supply today. By being able to bring out-of-state CO2 in, coupled with CO2 from the industries within our state, that can create the supply basis that we can use to help, again, continue to enable production from these tremendous resources that we have in the western states.
I think it's worth noting that there's other things from out of state, and that includes activists. You have folks from DC, from New York, and California trying to interdict and scaremonger people. Why, you ask? Well, it's not that they're not fighting for climate change. They're not against CO2 emissions. They're just against fossil fuels writ large. So even if you have a fossil operation that no longer has any emissions, they still don't think it should exist. And I think it's worth noting that we all have a role within our communities to help, to your point, Wade, educate and make sure they understand this. Not only that this is safe and that this is important for the region, but also don't be confused by these tricksters that are coming in trying to prevent what's best for the region. And sort of sticking within the region, why is the Midwest sort of tailor-made for building out CCUS? We'll go maybe backwards this time. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, maybe I just weigh in, certainly from Minn Kota's perspective, and as we've been working on Project Tundra, you're speaking about Midwest at large, but I'd like to specifically talk about the state of North Dakota, who's just been incredibly supportive of all the efforts and have done an incredible amount of legwork, 15 years of legwork, to put the policy and legal framework in place to handle things like primacy on Class 6 permitting, to make it possible that you could advance these projects like Summit and like Project Tundra, and EERC plays a critical role in all of it, but that you can advance these projects so all of a sudden we find ourselves being some of the most advanced projects of that nature in the world, and in large part that's due to an incredible amount of legwork by the administration of North Dakota, the legislative body, and the incredible support we've received. Couple that with the natural geological jackpot, and it's really a geological jackpot because our pore space is incredibly boring. There's no fractures, there's no fault lines underneath it. It's been studied to an incredible degree by the EERC and others, and there's just such a great deal of certainty surrounding it. With the state and permitting, you still have EPA MRV plans that really it just makes it the blueprint for other states to follow, including states in the Midwest, and they're working on it to get that framework in place to help advance these projects.
Yeah, there's quite a few states that are very envious of North Dakota's primacy when it comes to Class 6 injection, and are battling EPA right now to try and catch up with you all. So given how blessed the Midwest is, not only with natural resources, but also human resources, looking at ag and manufacturing, biofuels, renewables, what do you see as the interplay between CCUS and non-carbon operations? Go ahead, John.
I guess I can probably start, and I think a slide that Charlie had teed up when he was speaking about the hydrogen hub is a good starting point. Carbon capture and storage is a really big enabler, not just for those industries looking at implementing it, but for synergies with other industrial processes. So imagine that perhaps you have a coal-fired power generating facility that's capturing CO2 to produce low carbon or zero carbon electrons. They're selling that power perhaps to, some of that power is going out to homes, industrial sites, but maybe where there's excess availability, some of that power is getting sold for electrolysis. That low carbon energy is getting sold for electrolysis for hydrogen production. Parallel with that, some of that CO2 may be going to the Bakken oil to produce oil, incremental oil from where the investment in infrastructure and investment in wells have already been made. That oil that's being produced, studies have shown is some of the lowest carbon intensity oil. If you're using anthropogenic CO2 to produce oil, it's some of the lowest carbon intensity oil in the world. And some companies have even shown that if they use anthropogenic CO2 to produce oil, can more than offset the CO2 that becomes naturally stored as part of that process, more than offsets their entire Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. So now you're making low carbon oil and gas. Maybe some of that gas is going to hydrogen production as well. That hydrogen is being used to produce ammonia and low carbon fertilizer. Some of the hydrogen may be going to over-the-road trucking or farm implement. It goes to help lower the carbon intensity of corn growth or soybeans or other products. Those products are maybe going to an ethanol plant or a biodiesel refinery that is capturing CO2, storing that CO2, creating a very low carbon intensity product that's being able to demand a premium in low carbon fuel markets. And because we can do CCS, because we can do that in the Midwest and in North Dakota, it can enable all these industries and the interplay between these industries to really get to these net zero targets that are being set forth by governments, by our states, by our industries, and individual companies.
Maybe I'd just add in that it's much easier to chase net zero targets from a multiple industry perspective if it's profitable. You heard John just mention economic uplifts, and generally, if there's economic uplifts and incentives, and certainly the incentives exist today, the capital will flow, but these projects have to get built for that to trigger first. Governor Burgum in the Industrial Commission yesterday said something that really struck a chord and is absolutely true, and that's that capital will flow to regulatory certainty. So we have that in the state. Other parts of the Midwest are working on it, but we have it here today, and so the capital will flow in for these projects and really act as a launching pad for other low-carbon industries to utilize as well.
So, we hear it from the governor, from the lieutenant governor. It's a great tagline, innovation, not regulation. But it's all moving towards a goal of net zero at some point in the future. So where does CCUS fit within getting there in North Dakota and the region? How important is it? What percentage do you think roughly it's going to make up in the CO2 reduction? Maybe start with you, John.
All right. Well, so Tammy mentioned the governor's goal of net zero by 2030. I think with just the carbon capture and storage projects announced in North Dakota that are moving forward, we're probably pretty close to being able to store that amount of CO2, roughly the 30 million tons that North Dakota produces from per year from large point sources, being able to store that equivalent amount of CO2 in state, and very much be able to achieve or be close to achieving that goal by that time frame. If we look at more nationally or internationally, Charlie mentioned global population growth, but if you look at EIA numbers, they're projecting a 50% increase in global energy consumption by 2050. So we're going to need 50% more power in a little over 2 decades than we use today. And if you look at their projections, they expect renewables and biofuels to take up a large portion of that new load, but they're projecting stable to increase in hydrocarbon use, stable to increase in natural gas use, stable coal production globally, stable nuclear production globally. So if we're going to achieve, especially countrywide net zero goals, CCS is going to be an important part to decarbonize those industries that are producing some of the most stable, reliable baseload power, in the country.
Yeah, John hit on it, and certainly from a Minn Kota perspective, our number one goal is safe, reliable, and affordable power. And so baseload energy is certainly what we think about, but balancing that against net zero goals, those are, a lot of baseload energy comes from fossil fuel plants in the state and around the country. And so CCS really one of the few options to maintain baseload resources, but also substantially reduce CO2 emissions. If built, Project Tundra would have the ability to capture 4 million tons of CO2 annually and safely and securely inject and store into pore space. And that goes a long way if adopted. This would be the first of its kind at this scale. We don't expect to be the world's largest for long. That is the hope, that's a launching pad and somebody 2X's us not in the too distant future.
So there's a lot of optimism and a lot of potential for development of CCUS in the region and specifically in North Dakota. So we've kind of hit on it a little bit around the edges, but what are the barriers to achieving success, whether it's at your specific projects or whether it's the industry writ large? I'll start with you, Wade.
I appreciate the question. So I'd say, as you think about barriers, certainly you can't have carbon capture, transportation, and storage without transportation. And we've obviously proven that the transportation or the pipeline piece of this is most difficult. And within that, specifically, the barriers are to ultimately permit a multi-state system, and it requires a, call it consistent or established and defined regulatory process by which to do so. So for example, we're part of our projects in Minnesota. Well, the regulatory jurisdiction of CO2 pipelines in Minnesota was not established until the legislature established that was under the jurisdiction of the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission in this last legislative session. So hard to permit a project without a regulatory construct by which that can happen. Similarly, now in South Dakota, we are, sorting out the regulatory jurisdiction or the interplay between the local jurisdictions, the counties, and the state permitting authority of the South Dakota PUC. And so I think regulatory certainty and clarity in terms of what are the requirements, what is the process, and who has the authority is a significant barrier today in terms of advancing broad-scale CCS and ultimately the transportation component of CCS.
Yeah, on our part, some of the major hurdles which a lot of other companies who look at CCUS around the country are going to face have already been jumped over in the state of North Dakota. With the permitting in hand, we're right on top of the pore space. We've now brought in a potential major investor with TC Energy. We've got a joint development agreement and pushing development forward. But at the end of the day, the project it's not Minn Kota. We're not spending all of this capital on the backs of the members. this is a standalone project that we need outside capital in, and that outside capital comes in if it makes sense from an economic perspective to do that. So, you know, the pieces are there, the tax credit increase, the support from the state, support from the current administration. We need the economics to work at the end of the day. So how much does it cost? Is there margin there? And does it make sense from an investment perspective? Really is the final hurdle for us.
Anything additional from a macro level, John?
You know, I'd just kind of expound upon that and say stability and support are really important for these projects. As you look at developing a carbon capture storage project, you know, they don't happen overnight. It takes time. It can take several years to screen, qualify, design, and permit a geologic storage facility. So states that are set up to do it and have the legislation in place and the regulatory and structure in place for primacy can be a really big enabler, like states like North Dakota and Wyoming have. Stability is also important from a regulatory perspective and also from an incentive program perspective. Some of these projects are very capital intensive, and what we're seeing from some of the developers is that, you know, until you have that geologic storage facility in place, they may not be able to get to a final investment decision on putting some pretty substantial investment in the capture and transportation infrastructure. So you may be looking at several years before you get a revenue stream coming back in from these projects, and that's a lot of upfront capital before you get start getting returns.
So not all utilities are created equal, which is to say that a cooperative has a different mission than an investor-owned utility. And if you look at the larger investor-owned utilities across the country, they've almost all made commitments to move at different rates away from fossil fuels. So how, to the extent that we're burning less fossil fuel writ large, how does that lack of availability of carbon impact the development of a nascent industry that needs critical mass in order to get to sort of a scalability and commercial success?
Yeah, no, great question. And certainly, like you said, all utilities are not created equal. And Xcel Energy, being one of our prime sponsors here today, has a different set of metrics that they have to think about. They're obviously much larger than Minn Kota, and they've got quarterly earnings and shareholders and just a different way of thinking and operating, and also just a much larger purview to consider, for example. So as these utilities are shutting down fossil fuel across the country, and certainly from a power supply planning perspective, there's times where you look at those shutdowns and you can see how that would make sense for certain utilities to do that. But like you said, with a nascent industry, it really needs to catch on, and you know, part of that is some of these projects have got to get built and have got to be successful, and we really need the grid operators who are showing up at Congress and testifying that we just cannot shut down all of the baseload energy at the same time, understanding the carbon transition, but you cannot have a mass exodus of baseload energy. So if CCS can play a role in that transitionary period, we see that being, you know, one possible option to move forward.
Well, I think we're at time. So if you would, please, a round of applause for our panelists. And to close things out, I'd like to invite Catherine Grinberg, the Chamber's Executive Vice President, to give closing remarks.
Thank you, Christopher, and to the panel. What a great morning and a great way to close out the event. There is so much happening in the energy industry, and I think that was demonstrated here today with all the various topics that we were able to cover, and we didn't even touch all of them. The one theme that stuck out to me the most as I listened to the speakers and the panels was the word opportunity. It seems that we have so much opportunity to educate, to collaborate, to innovate, just opportunity to lead in the Midwest in this industry. So as we leave here today, I would encourage us all to really intentionally recognize the opportunity that we each have in moving this industry forward as we've continued to do. So with that, thank you again to our sponsors, Cass County Electric and Xcel Energy, as well as the rest of our sponsors, partners, co-hosts, speakers, and attendees. We really appreciate you being here today and engaging in this conversation. We will see you all at our Economic Summit in February. Have a great rest of your day.